Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. President Trump confirms there are no survivors after an American Airlines flight crashes into a Black Hawk helicopter above Washington, D.C. 3 Israeli hostages are released by Hamas but swarmed by crowds in Khan Yunis. And Guantanamo 2.0, Trump commissions a new migrant detention facility designed to hold 30,000 people. To our top story, and President Trump says there are no survivors after an American Airlines plane and a military helicopter collided over Washington, D.C.'s Potomac River. 64 people were traveling on the commercial flight and 3 on board the Black Hawk aircraft. Just before the collision, air traffic controllers at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport attempted to warn the helicopter to avoid the aeroplane carrying 60 passengers before diverting other planes away from the crash. Take a listen.
Pass 25, get the CRJ in flight. Pass 25, pass behind this CRJ.
Did you see that?
472. American 3130, go around, turn left end 250, climb maintain 3000. Blue Sea 5347, go around, climb maintain 3000, flight
3000, heading 47, go around 3000, Blue Streak 5347.
Blackjack 3, can you return to base? Blackjack 3, proceed directly to Glebe. I need you to land. I need you to land immediately. Can you go to Dulles for a few minutes?
In the last hour, President Trump confirmed there were no survivors and paid tribute to those who have lost their lives and said it was an hour of anguish for the nation.
This was a dark and excruciating night in our nation's capital and in our nation's history, and a tragedy of terrible proportions. As one nation, we grieve for every precious soul that has been taken from us so suddenly. And we are a country of, really, we are in mourning. This is really shaking a lot of people, including people, very sadly, from other nations who were on the flight. For the family members back in Wichita, Kansas, here in Washington, D.C., and throughout the United States and in Russia, we have a Russia contingent, some very talented people, unfortunately, were on that plane. Very, very, very sorry about that. Whose loved ones were aboard the passenger jet. We can only begin to imagine the agony that you're all feeling.
Let's go live to Washington now to speak to our correspondent, Caroline Malone. Caroline, thank you for joining me. Officials have said this has moved from a rescue operation to a recovery operation. We just heard Donald Trump there saying the country is in mourning. Tell us more.
Yes, absolutely. Hearing there from President Donald Trump just how tragic and sad and how much the country is in mourning now, given this tragic accident. A lot of questions were also put to President Trump about the cause of this incident. And I think that is where, investigators are now looking into a number of different factors as to what could have caused this crash. You can see behind me, there is the air traffic control tower from Reagan Airport. That is where people were communicating with the pilots on American Airlines and were communicating with the pilots on the Black Hawk helicopter. That crashed about 9 p.m. on Wednesday evening. And in some of the recordings, as you heard earlier, there is some directing to different altitudes for those aircraft. And President Trump in particular picked up on that, saying that the helicopter should not have been at the same altitude as the commercial airliner. He said, and perhaps somewhat speculating, that the pilots should have been able to see the commercial flight from the air. There was also some talk of night vision goggles. The Black Hawk helicopter pilots were on a training mission and would have had night vision goggles with them. Some speculation as to whether that was helping or hindering, because it might have reduced the vision of the pilots at that altitude. But certainly President Trump seemed to be pointing the finger towards those that were either in the aircraft, but also to air traffic control, He made a suggestion, in fact, to connect their mission towards some of the issues that Trump has pointed out with diversity, equity and inclusion. You know, that's a program, or many programs, that he has tried to cut across the country, suggesting that it impedes the standard of work in a number of areas. That was also suggested by the Vice President Vance, who spoke alongside President Trump, as well as the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who also spoke in the same press conference. So they're making that kind of suggestion there that that could have been associated. But really, we don't have, you know, the full evidence yet. It's still too early to say really what caused this crash until we get the black box, until we get more from the investigators from the Defense Department who's looking into this. We won't know exactly what caused it. What we do know from officials, though, is that this was preventable. It does appear that this was a tragic accident that did not need to happen. And we are looking now, of course, that all those involved would have died.
I just want to pick up there. You talked about Pete Hegseth. It's the first week in the job for him, and Defense Secretary Sean Duffy. Transport Secretary Sean Duffy. It's his second day in the job. How have they reacted to this incident?
Well, the Defence Secretary, Pete Hegseth, as you say, has only been in the job a few days, but he's already given a number of press conferences, particularly regarding this crash, and giving updates as to what has been happening. Of course, the Pentagon, his department, leads the investigation into what's happened here. He's spoken in particular about the battalion involved. So there was members of the Army, 3 pilots who were in that helicopter that was part of the crash. And the battalion has actually suspended its duties, he said, for 48 hours after this incident. You know, presumably that team of people is very much in mourning, very much in shock as to what happened. But, you know, clearly a lot of questions will be raised as well about their training work, about what they were doing in that helicopter, about their protocols and the standards that were being issued, because, you know, they were involved in this absolutely tragic crash that we have heard is in some senses thought to be preventable. So clearly there'll be some scrutiny on that as well. You know, clearly a difficult position for anyone new into a job and this type of tragic crash happening. But there has been a lot of controversy even before the Defence Secretary Hegseth came into the job. He was questioned very heavily at a Senate hearing before his confirmation, but in particular the opposition party, Democrats, challenging over his lack of experience. And so you can only imagine that that will be something that people will continue to be asking about. But, you know, on a lot of levels, particularly when you hear from President Trump, it looks like signals are pointing towards some kind of procedural error, whether it was from the pilots aboard the helicopter or whether it was from the air traffic control that didn't distance these aircraft enough to prevent this crash. But I think we'll have to wait until we get more information to really make, you know, a full conclusion about what's happened here.
Caroline Malone in Washington, thank you so much for joining me. Let's get into this further with a former pilot turned senior lecturer in aviation operations at Buckinghamshire New University, Marco Chan. Marco, thank you for joining me. We've heard the audio from air traffic control. As a former pilot, explain the process of bringing a plane into land and the communications you have with air traffic control to make sure everything is safe.
Hello, and thank you for having me. And first of all, my condolences to the family of the victims. But to answer your question, as a former pilot, it's a very complicated airspace, and as you can tell, there will have to be a lot of coordination between the pilots and the air traffic controllers. When we get closer to the airport, we are usually handled by what we call an approach frequency, where the air traffic controllers will sequence the aeroplanes. They will give you guidance in terms of altitude, the speed, and the direction for tracking as well. So think of it like a controlled descent down a staircase rather than flying straight down to it for a drop. Usually when we're about 10 to 15 miles from the runway, we'll try to slow the aircraft down. We'll start configuring the aircraft. For example, when you're in the cabin, you hear noise coming from the wings, for example, be extending the flaps, the slats, would be dropping the landing gear for the landing. eventually will be cleared for the approach. So remember, this is a clearance for the approach, i.e. we can align straight with the runway, not the landing though. But then when you get closer to the runway itself, we'll get handed over to the tower frequency, which is the ATC recording you will have heard earlier. That is from the tower frequency, where a landing clearance would be issued together with the wind conditions, as you would have heard the wind direction, the wind strength as well, and exactly which runway you are cleared to land. And as pilots, we will have to repeat the instruction as a confirmation, and then we will be able to land the aeroplane from that point onward.
Marco, a lot of people have spoken about it was a really clear night. How could the military aircraft not have seen the passenger plane? But is it normal practice for a military aircraft to be flying so close to a commercial plane like we saw in this instance?
Well, yes, first of all, it was a clear night, according to the weather report as well. However, we must remind ourselves it is nighttime after all, even though there are lights around, the beacon lights, the strobe lights, for example, to help locate the traffic. It is still comparatively more difficult than daytime. But as to your question, though, yes, military aircraft, they actually do frequently operate in controlled civilian airspace, of course, under the coordination and control by the air traffic controllers, particularly with the training exercises as well. So with airports similar to the Washington one, military helicopters and civilian jets quite often share the airspace. It requires very careful coordination as well. But they do actually operate in a very different flight profile. As you can imagine, helicopters, they tend to be flying at a lower speed. They will rely on what we call VFR, visual flight routes, i.e. using their eyes to maneuver. A very different climb and descent capabilities compared to jets as well. So it's a very challenging environment for the air traffic controller as well. As to why they are flying so low or so close to civilian aircraft or the flight path, it would depend on the need or the necessity of the training exercise. Now, based on my own experience, a lot of the airports I've operated to, quite often the helicopters or the helipads are quite close to the runway itself. However, we, and including the helicopter pilots, are reminded to have visual or what we call insight of the traffic of each other, so we know constantly where the traffic is.
The US Transport Secretary Sean Duffy has said he thinks this crash was preventable. Do you agree with that, or is this just a fatal incident that was unfortunate?
I would say it's always an element of being unfortunate for a series of events, a chain of events to have caused an accident is never really a single reason. But having said that, I tend to agree with the Transport Secretary, Sean Duffy here. A lot of accidents are preventable. For example, what happened in this accident, a mid-air collision, they are typically preventable if they have followed the separation procedure, follow the ATC instructions, for example, or the pilots have the situational awareness of what's going on. In the current case, the air traffic controller, we could hear the conversation. They were trying to manage the separation as well. And from what we can hear from the ATC conversation, with the tower issuing a collision advisory and confirming whether the helicopter had the CRJ 700 in sight. Remember, they did ask the PAT 25 whether they had the traffic in sight. On a separate frequency, this is something I want to highlight to a lot of audience as well. From the recording, it doesn't appear the helicopter pilots were responding to the air traffic controllers. In fact, they had responded, but they were on a different frequency. This is quite common practice for military traffic to be operating on a discrete frequency, or so-called, which is why we only heard one-way sort of transmission, but there were recordings picked up from a separate frequency with the helicopter pilots acknowledging they had the visual contact and they had requested visual separation, to which the request was granted by air traffic controllers. However, just seconds later, the collision occurred, indicating either there was a last-moment misjudgment in positioning or depth perception may have contributed to the incident. There's also footage of the radar screen as well within the air traffic control room, where the PAC-25 was visible on the ATC's surveillance radar. So within the ATC, they have a surveillance radar to check the movement of the aircraft, and it appeared a collision advisory was issued in the control room as well, which is why the ATC controller did actively ask whether they had visual with the traffic and whether they could maintain the visual separation.
Marco Chan, former pilot turned senior lecturer in aviation operations at Buckinghamshire New University. Thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
To Gaza now, and 3 Israeli hostages have been freed by Hamas today as part of the ceasefire deal. Agam Berger, Arbal Yehud and Gabi Moses were released after 15 months in Gaza. In exchange, Israel agreed to free 110 Palestinians who'd been held in Israeli jails. However, their release was delayed due to crowds and chaos surrounding the Israeli hostages in the earlier handover. We can now cross live to Tel Aviv to speak to our correspondent, Giles Gibson. Good evening to you, Giles. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has condemned the chaotic hostage handover scenes as shocking and horrific. This is the third exchange in the ceasefire deal. Who controls the security at these moments? And why is it so uncontrollable, as we saw today?
Well, in terms of the logistics of these handovers of hostages, the people in charge are either Hamas or the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, coordinating all of the action that we saw playing out over the course of the day. I think it's interesting to point out the distinction between what we saw playing out first in Jabalia, the first release of the day. Agam Berger, the 20-year-old Israeli soldier, she was brought up on stage. There was a large crowd there. She was surrounded by Hamas militants wearing masks and carrying weapons. But really the scenes there were nothing compared to the chaotic scenes that we saw later on in the day in Khan Yunis, those crowds gathering around the hostages themselves, and also the Red Cross vehicles that have been sent to collect them and take them out of the enclave. Those chaotic scenes, as you mentioned, leading to some very strong criticism from right at the top of the Israeli government as those chaotic scenes played out.
The Israeli hostages, as you just mentioned there, looked visibly shaken as they made their way to the Red Cross. The Hostage Families and Missing Families Forum have said the process was marked by cruelty and disregard for human dignity. Is this Hamas's intention? Do they want to continue spreading fear even beyond the handover?
Well, what many analysts have been saying, watching the different rounds of hostage handovers, is that this is all about Hamas in particular just projecting power in a way to sort of push back against Israeli officials like Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, talking for many months now about how the entire aim of the war in Gaza is to wipe out, to destroy Hamas. You know, we saw that in terms of the political theatre, first up in Jabalia, those Hamas militants up on stage with masks, with weapons, and also the Israeli soldier being brought up in front of that large crowd. And then even in Khan Yunis, aside from the chaotic scenes, the large crowd that we saw, there was also some symbolism in the fact that the handover took place very close to the ruined home of the former leader of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar. Sinwar, of course, killed by Israeli forces earlier on in the conflict. So every single detail of these handovers is really being carefully managed to project a certain image to the world.
Giles, we mentioned those 110 Palestinian prisoners. Their release was held up. What's the latest on that situation?
Yeah, so initially there was concern that the concerns amongst Israeli officials about the handling of these handovers, the scenes, especially in Khan Yunis, that this could lead to some sort of a breakdown in communication, that eventually we could see some sort of tensions in terms of the ceasefire deal holding. We had at one point in the day the spokesperson for the Israeli Prime Minister saying that they had made the decision very clearly to delay the release of Palestinian prisoners in exchange for those Israeli hostages because of the scenes that were playing out in Khan Yunis. We then, within a few hours, had the Israeli government coming out again saying that they had received assurances about how the future handovers are going to be handled, assurances that we won't see the kind of scenes that played out in Khan Yunis again. And then after some hours of waiting, some nervous hours, those white buses that were taking the 110 Palestinian prisoners, they departed for the West Bank, and so that kind of latest stage of this process did indeed play out after a delay that was concerning to many of the mediators who've brokered that ceasefire deal in the first place.
Giles Gibson in Tel Aviv, thank you. Returning to Washington now, where President Trump has ordered a new migrant detention center in Guantanamo Bay, intended to hold as many as 30,000 people. The facility would be based at the U.S. naval base in Cuba, alongside its high-security military prison. Trump says the center would house the worst criminal illegal aliens threatening the American people. Guantanamo Bay was originally opened in 2002 by President Bush following the 9/11 attacks and has faced international criticism in regards to its treatment of prisoners. Both Barack Obama and Joe Biden attempted to close the facility during their presidential terms. We are now joined by our foreign correspondent, Sarah Firth. Sarah, thank you so much for joining me. Sarah, tell us more about this new facility that President Trump has commissioned. When are we expecting it to be built, and who exactly will be sent there?
Well, the secret blackout goggles for detainees who've been taken there in the past, phone calls with lawyers monitored, and facilities that are said to not be fit to standard for living with rat infestation. These are just some of the allegations that we've heard from charities, human rights organizations that have in the past said that these areas in Guantanamo that have been used to house detainees and migrants are just not fit for purpose. Now, as you mentioned, there is so much controversy around Guantanamo. What you've seen President Trump do is reverse what we've seen many presidents do, including, as you said, President Obama, which is vow to close Guantanamo. This is the opposite of that. This is an expansion of that U.S. base in Cuba. Now, what we know at this point is that Trump has signed this executive order. He did so at the White House behind me just a few days ago. And he has instructed the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, to oversee this, which he says is going to be 30,000 people that will be able to be detained there. We know that it looks like the U.S. Coast Guards are going to be taking detainees that they catch at sea directly to those facilities. Now, as to whether they're actually going to be building on top of the facilities already at Guantanamo Bay, that's not clear. What we do know is that you've got that controversial high security prison. This area, and there is a separate area that's been there for some time, is another area where people can be housed. Whether it can hold those 30,000 people or whether that will need an expansion remains to be seen. But the Department for Homeland Security, they've been asked questions about what this is going to look like. Their own investigators in 2023 went there and said there was cause for concern in the facility. So they said on record at the moment that the facilities they think are fairly standard with their detention facilities, but there are huge questions around this. And as I said, so much secrecy around exactly what those facilities will look like.
As we just mentioned, the treatment of prisoners held in Guantanamo Bay has been heavily criticised by human rights campaigners over the years. Also, you know, as you mentioned, former presidents have vowed to shut it down. What exactly is Trump's reasoning behind this idea?
Well, look, he very proudly announced this when he signed that executive order. You know, no qualms about the fact that he was doing something with Guantanamo Bay, as we said, that many presidents have tried to reverse, and that human rights groups for many, many years have roundly condemned. Now, you've got to look at the wider picture here with what President Trump is trying to do. He feels, his mandate, he got his position in the White House running on this very hardline anti-immigration policy. So this signing into this executive order to use Guantanamo Bay in this way, this is all part of his crackdown on immigration. He wants to be perceived as taking this serious action to deliver on his promise to the American people. He said of deporting some 10 million undocumented migrants. Now, I can tell you, speaking to members of migrant communities here in the United States over the last week, there is real fear here among them about what that could mean for many members of the community. We've already seen a lot of detentions taking place. We've seen the White House itself release video showing people in chains, raids being conducted, and people being taken from their homes and workplaces. So there is a lot of concern over how this is playing out right now. That is the human impact of this hardline anti-immigration policy. But also, it's interesting to note that if you look at the numbers right now, and look, it is early days for President Trump in the White House, but the numbers right now, as shocking as many human rights organizations have found them, they are not even close to meeting that promise that President Trump made for the 10 million figure. So he has got his work cut out when it comes to playing to that anti-immigration crowd that he feels gave him this mandate, got him back into the White House. And of course, this is causing fear amongst migrant communities. It's causing huge uproar with human rights charities. And this latest news with Guantanamo Bay, it just plays in to all of this, that this is a return to the dark old days of secret detentions taking place on US territories with the oversight and stamp of approval of the White House.
Sarah Firth, a foreign correspondent in Washington, thank you for joining me. Now, the Congolese President Felix Tshisekedi is vowing to restore government authority in the east, where Rwanda-backed M23 rebels have seized control of the city of Goma and are pushing south. In a televised address to the nation, he said a vigorous and coordinated response was underway. He also criticized the international community for inaction in the wake of the escalating security crisis. Let's speak to our correspondent now in Kinshasa, Chris Ochamaringa. Chris, thank you so much for joining me. First of all, what is the mood on the ground? This must be a frightening, uncertain time for so many people in the DRC.
It is indeed a very tough period for many people in the DRC because ever since this conflict started in 2021, there have been tens and tens of thousands of Congolese people who have died and more than 2 million others who have been displaced from their homes in North Kivu province. And we spoke to some of these displaced people. All they want is the restoration of peace so that they can go back to their homes and engage in their usual activities. They are sick and tired of fleeing from one area to another because of the M23 rebels who have captured a lot of areas in that area. But the president's statement has been basically a declaration of war, calling on Congolese people to rally behind the army and that they are going to mount an offensive to reclaim all the territories that have been taken by the M23 rebels backed by the Rwandan forces. But there are other Congolese citizens, especially those living in the west and central parts of the country, who are totally in support of the president because they're saying that they have suffered for far too long. Ever since the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, where about 2 million ethnic Hutus, some of whom participated in killing ethnic Tutsis in Rwanda, crossed into the east of the DRC, which was then known as Zaire, they were planning to organize themselves and go back to Rwanda and topple the government. We have seen the Rwandan government then, that was led by President Paul Kagame, invaded Congo. And from that time on, there has been a cycle of violence for about 3 decades now. So these people in the east of the DRC want to see a military solution to this conflict. But the international community is working with other regional blocs in the continent to stop this from happening.
Chris, you just mentioned there that a declaration of war essentially from the president, but the M23 rebels are now moving south. So we know that they've basically captured Goma. What does this mean? Is it a significant escalation to the fighting, as you've mentioned?
It is very significant because the area where they are heading to in South Kivu province is very rich in minerals and other natural resources, which bring a lot of revenue to the coffers of the DRC government. So if they indeed manage to capture that area, it will be a big blow to the Congolese government. Authorities in Kinshasa have said that they have deployed troops to that area to stave off the advance of the M23 rebels who are backed by Rwandan forces, but it's still not clear whether they will manage to stop the advance of the rebels. And there's also concern about, the targeting of certain communities in that area because they're ethnic Tutsis who live in that area. They're known as the Banyamulenge. And in the past, they have been linked to rebellions that were backed with Rwanda. So some of the community members might start targeting them. And so this is a very serious escalation that people in the region who are trying to mediate peace are trying to stop from happening.
Chris O'Chamaringa, please keep yourself safe, based in Kinshasa. Thank you for joining me. And a reminder of our top stories. President Trump confirms there are no survivors after an American Airlines flight crashes into a Black Hawk helicopter above Washington, D.C. 3 Israeli hostages are released by Hamas, but swarmed by crowds in Khan Yunis. And Guantanamo 2.0, Trump commissions a new migrant detention facility designed to hold 30,000 people. And that's all from us on W News. Thank you so much for joining us. Riz Khan is coming up next. And don't miss Tom Burges Watson with GNT. Good night.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome. I'm Riz Khan. While the world leaders debate the future state of the oceans during the latest COP event in Azerbaijan, my guest on this episode is a remarkable young man who's already making a major positive impact on the ocean environment. The Dutch entrepreneur Boyan Slat has been a CEO for over a decade. He's devoted more than half of his life to saving the planet from plastic, and yet he only recently reached the age of 30. Boyan's non-profit company, Ocean Cleanup, has been on an ambitious mission to rid the seas and rivers of plastic since 2013. It has invented technology that's transforming the pollution of our seas and rivers, and its work is saving wildlife, fisheries, tourism, and economies. Ocean Cleanup is also preventing plastic from entering the food chain and ultimately ending up on our own plates.
We can clean up the Great Pacific Garbage Patch in 10 years' time at a cost of $7.5 billion. So that's less than half of what America is spending on Halloween decorations on an annual basis.
In a wide-ranging conversation, we discussed how achievable Boyan's mission is today. Plus, I got a glimpse inside the mind of a driven and determined young innovator who entered the record books at just 14 after experimenting with rockets and explosives. Boyan, great to have a chance to have a chat. Now, many would argue you can't put a price on having clean oceans, but you've effectively done just that. You recently revealed your assessment of how long it will take to complete your mission to remove plastic from the seas and how much it will cost. Now, people might be surprised by the numbers, so tell me what you know.
Sure, yeah. So at the current level of performance, so basically what we have already achieved to date, we can clean up the Great Pacific Garbage Patch in 10 years' time at a cost of $7.5 billion. So that's less than half of what America is spending on Halloween decorations on an annual basis. Now, so I think, it's compared to a world problem, it's something that we should be able to afford. However, we were also looking to do it even faster and even cheaper. So by improving the way we detect where the highest concentrations of plastic are inside of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, we think we can actually do it in just 5 years' time at a cost of $4 billion. So yeah, really now for the first time ever, we know what it will take to return the Pacific Ocean to its clean and pristine state.
That's a fascinating comparison, literally half of Halloween decorations in the US. Yep. But give me this perspective, because there are always skeptics out there. Why do you see this as value for money? What else could you get for that amount?
Yeah, so I think it's important to put it in the context of not cleaning the ocean, right? And according to a study done by Deloitte a couple of years ago, the plastic pollution problem as a whole is costing humanity up to $19 billion per year. And if you take into account all the ecosystem services that the ocean is providing, you're actually looking north of $500 billion in terms of harm that the pollution is doing to our ocean every year. So if you think in terms of ROI, it's way cheaper to clean the ocean than to not clean the ocean.
Let me ask you about this, because obviously there's a trail involved. How does plastic get from the factory to the ocean?
Yes, every year humanity uses roughly 400 million tons of plastic per year. During its use, it's providing a lot of value to humanity. It's a versatile material. It's an energy efficient material as well. But unfortunately, not all of that plastic gets collected and processed in a responsible way. So you'll have essentially leakage from the system, and some of that plastic is able to end up in our waterways, so in rivers in particular, and through rivers it then ends up in the ocean. So and we're talking about quite a small fraction, so less than 0.5% of the plastic that's being used ends up in rivers and flows into the ocean. But of course, that 0.5% is able to do a tremendous amount of harm to the environment, to coastal economies, and also to humanity in terms of the potential health risks of that plastic ending up in our food chain.
Isn't that amazing? It's such a small percentage, yet so important. We'll talk more about the important role of rivers in transporting plastic waste to the sea. Give us some idea of what happens when it gets there.
So once plastic is in the ocean, actually most of it only stays in the ocean for a relatively short time. So the majority will end up back on shore, on coastlines, washes up in a matter of weeks to months. And of course, that's still not a good thing, right? Because it damages tourism. Coastlines are also important ecosystems. But effectively, most of it removes itself from the ocean in a relatively short amount of time. But some plastic is able to make its way all the way to the open ocean, where if it does, it will end up in one of the 5 gyres. So that's an area where ocean currents converge, where plastic can enter, but it can never leave. And out of those 5 oceanic gyres that exist on Earth, the largest one is in the North Pacific, and that's also the most polluted one. So more than half of the world's plastic pollution that's stuck in the ocean can be found in that one, and that's of course the infamous Great Pacific Garbage Patch.
Plastic accumulates in huge subtropic oceanic areas called gyres. massive circular currents that trap the plastic for decades, if not centuries. There are 5 gyres in our oceans. The most polluted and best studied is the infamous Great Pacific Garbage Patch, located in the North Pacific Ocean between Hawaii and California.
It's interesting, so to explain for our viewers, gyre you mean by almost like a gyroscopic swirl of water, and the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is something that I remember discussing years ago. What is it? What would you want people to know about that, and what do you remember about encountering it for the first time?
Yeah, so it's so if we take the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is the largest accumulation of trash on Earth, this is an area that spans an area 3 times the size of France. It contains more than 100 million kilos of plastic. And what's really fascinating is to when we take that plastic out and we look at the age of the plastic, we see that a lot of it is actually very old plastic because, again, once it's there to stay. It's stuck indefinitely until, of course, it ends up in the stomach of a fish or whatnot. But in principle, it's there to stay for a very long time. So we even see stuff dating back to the 1960s that are still. We even had a Vietnam War drinking bottle from the U.S. Army that we found in still recognizable shape, still floating around out there in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. So that really goes to show that why we have to go out there and clean it up. Sure, of course, it's essential to prevent more plastic from entering the ocean. But if that's the only thing we do, the ocean will be polluted forever because those ocean garbage patches, they persist, and that's why I have to go out and clean this up.
Let's go back to rivers, and you'd mentioned a little bit about rivers playing, in terms of small percentage, but quite a high role, or quite an important role in all this. What are the numbers we should know about the pollution in rivers?
Yeah. So firstly, again, it's just a very small fraction of all the world's plastic that is being consumed that ends up in the ocean. And what's also fascinating is that those emissions are very concentrated in really just a small fraction of the world's rivers. So what we found in a study we published a few years ago is that just 1% of the world's rivers is responsible for roughly 80% of all the plastic that ends up in the ocean. So with a relatively sort of targeted intervention, intercepting the plastic in those 1% of the world's rivers, we can really stop most of the world's plastic emissions from polluting the ocean. Now, that 1% still accounts for 1,000 rivers, right? So it's still a big scope, but the good thing is that they are concentrated in a relatively small number of coastal cities, especially in middle-income countries. So Southeast Asia, West Africa, Latin America. Those are really the plastic pollution hotspots. So those are countries where there's now enough wealth to consume a lot of packaged goods wrapped in plastic. So you have a lot of waste generation, but where the infrastructure to then take care of that waste is really lacking. And just to give some more color to that, there's one river in Guatemala that we're operating in, where that one river is actually responsible for more plastic emissions to the oceans than all the developed countries combined. Just one river. So that's why we focus our work in those places where the problem is biggest, and where we can have essentially the biggest bang for our buck.
Boyan's interest, you could say obsession, with plastic waste in the seas was famously triggered by a scuba diving trip to Greece as a teenager. You'll know the expression, "I can't see the wood for the trees." Well, Boyan couldn't see the fish for the plastic bags, but he could see a problem and he had a vision to solve it. But his problem-solving appetite had begun at an even earlier age. I'd like to roll back the years and talk about the start of your incredible journey as someone who seemed Well, I guess incredibly curious, driven and determined from a very early age. Your explorations involved explosives, launching rockets. At one point, you almost burnt down your family home.
Correct. Yeah. My mom didn't particularly like that phase. But yeah, I've always been very fascinated about technology and making things, building things, and so I've never been bored as a child, and always had my projects, right? So I had my own chemistry experiments, built my own computers. Actually, going all the way back, when I was 2, I used some wood and a hammer and nails to make my own chair. So always been had this urge to build and create. Indeed, when I was 12 or 13, I was really into some model rockets, and I decided to set a Guinness World Record by launching more than 200 of them at the same time. Again, not very useful, but it was just the way I kept myself busy. And sort of asking myself a question, what if I could do this? Could I have this idea? Could I make that happen? That's probably the thing I've always asked myself throughout my childhood. And it's also the type of question that I asked myself when I was 16 years old. When scuba diving in Greece, came across more plastic bags than fish. And I asked myself, why can't I clean this up? So I kind of see this as a continuation of my childhood.
Now, Boyan, a key moment in your journey was a TED Talk in which you laid out your ideas and it went viral. Tell me about that feedback you had from that TED Talk and the realization that there were people out there who did share your passion.
So please, don't tell me we can't clean this up together. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so at the time when I did that presentation, I was studying aerospace engineering at university here, and I had this idea. I had the opportunity to present that idea at this TEDx presentation. And a few months passed, and there wasn't really any traction. And at that point in time, I actually thought, okay, to give this idea any chance of success, I should probably drop out of university, dedicate all my time to this. And then again, few tough months followed. I approached 300 companies for help and sponsorship, and only one replied. And that person said, "This is a terrible idea. You should go back to school." So that was hard. But then suddenly there was some news blog that picked up the story, embedded the video of my presentation, and suddenly this blew up. And within no time, this video was watched, I think, over 1 million times. And that then allowed me to assemble an initial team, back then still volunteers, and also run a crowdfunding campaign to get the seed money to get started.
That crowdfunding campaign raised a staggering $2 million, with tens of thousands of donations from more than 150 countries. Ocean Cleanup was launched, but it would have to navigate through stormy weather on its voyage to save the seas.
It took us 8 years to finally have a system that worked. And throughout that time, we've had so many near-death experiences of almost running out of money, systems that broke down. I think we've done a few hundred prototype tests until we had something that worked. So it's so I remember vividly. We launched that new system. It was summer 2021. We deployed in the patch, and actually the first tests, they didn't look very good. We were only collecting like a very small pile of trash, and it was just another one of those moments like where did we mess up? Why is it not working again this time? And then a few days later we deployed the system again. We took the system back on deck. We emptied it out, and there was just this. So I woke up in the morning and I opened my phone and I see all these missed message calls and text messages, and I opened up my phone and I saw this photo of this massive mountain of plastic on deck, and that's definitely one of the biggest highlights. It's like almost like all of the pain of the 8 years was made it worth it for that brief moment when we finally knew we had a system that worked and that we could clean up the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And by the way, it just turned out that we were in essentially sort of an empty part of the garbage patch in those first days. So we were essentially being fooled by the density of plastic. So that was a tremendous relief. And then of course we just got better and better to now the point that we can actually get the job done in just a couple of years' time.
I know you've been constantly working to improve your cleanup operation. I wonder how effective is the current system you have in contrast to your early attempts?
Yeah, so it's been a long journey to get to this point. It was 2018 when we launched our first system, which firstly didn't collect plastic, which was quite an important requirement for an ocean cleanup system. It also broke into two, which again was sort of, as we like to refer to it, as an unscheduled learning opportunity. So we learned a lot from those early days, early failures. But now fast forward to today, we have this massive 1.5 mile long cleanup system with which we can actually clean an area the size of a football field every 5 seconds. So it is tremendously effective. Now it's really about scaling it up. So we know it can be done. We have now given humans the tool we need to clean it up, but now it's really about who is willing to make it happen and fund the expansion to a whole fleet of systems, with which we then are able to clean up the whole ocean.
That's fascinating, Boy. And so literally a football pitch in 5 seconds. But I guess when you're talking of a patch 3 times the size of France, that's a lot of football pitches.
Yes, yeah, exactly. We've had one system out there for the past 3 years doing all the testing and development work, and in that time we've swept an area roughly the size of New Jersey. So it does add up over time, of course, but to really clean up the ocean in 5 years' time, what you're going to need is a fleet of systems, roughly 20 of them. Which is, and then once you have that, you can actually clean up the Great Pacific Garbage Patch.
I was blown away by when you said you'd found literally kind of old plastic, such as I think you said a plastic bottle from the Vietnam War in the garbage patch. So I wonder, what are some of the strangest things your team has recovered from the ocean?
Yeah, it's looking at our trash, it's like modern day archaeology. It's always super interesting to see what we collect. We also post these on our social media, so definitely recommend to check that out. But it's everything. It's stuff ranging from mannequins to golf balls to AstroTurf, plastic toys, dolls' houses. It's wild to see what's out there.
It might seem likely that local and national governments would support efforts towards cleaner rivers, beaches and fisheries, but it's not always the case. What about the business world or plastic manufacturers? And what role do we have as consumers? I wanted to find out who's helping the Ocean Cleanup Project and who's not.
So when it comes to these ocean garbage patches, the issue is that it's international waters. What's interesting is that, for example, if you look at the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, we are able to link the plastic to the 5 big industrialized countries in the North Pacific. So I think there is a case to be made that they should step up and take at least some responsibility for this. When it comes to rivers, so what we do there is we put systems in those most polluting rivers to catch it before it can reach the ocean. We're currently already stopping about 2% of the emissions. We are in 16 rivers around the world and in 8 countries. But doing those first projects, it does take time to build up those relationships with governments, and I must say I've never really felt an unwillingness to support. Governments recognize that there is this problem, and they welcome the collaboration, and we support them. And in many places, they actually operate the interceptor, so that makes it financially sustainable on the long term as well. Right. But governments are just large and bureaucratic, so they are quite slow generally, right? So getting the permits to deploy, getting the contract secured, that usually is the limiting factor in how fast we can roll out our interceptor projects.
And yet it's an international problem. So how are global institutions like the United Nations helping you tackle it?
So we do have a partnership with the United Nations Development Program, who help open doors with those national governments. I think what's quite interesting, of course, we would welcome the support of the UN. And I think especially when you talk about the ocean garbage patches, it is an international problem, and this waste just travels, through many different countries and their waters, right? But what's interesting about the river problem is that you don't need any altruism, or you don't need any international cooperation to get this done, because actually, the biggest victim of the pollution that flows out of Indonesia's rivers is Indonesia, right? And the biggest victim of Panama's pollution is Panama, because most of that trash will stay in those coastal waters, will wash up on shore, and therefore there's just a selfish economic reason for these countries to step up and intercept that plastic before it goes into the ocean, which I think is a good thing, because international cooperation is notoriously difficult. So I do expect governments to be much faster in adopting what we do in rivers than international waters.
Boyan, how about a little finger pointing here? How about the business world? Are the plastic manufacturers searching for solutions, or are they actually continuing to add to the problem they helped to create?
Yeah, well, at the Ocean Cleanup, we are about solutions. We don't point fingers. But at the same time, I think, be it governments, be it plastic producers, be it the companies that use the plastic that produce the packaging, the Coca-Colas of this world, and even the users of the plastic. I think everyone has played a role in creating this problem, and therefore I think everyone also should have the opportunity to really be part of the solution. So, I think if there's any industry that has benefited from all this cheap plastic and the production of it, they are the plastic producers and the companies that use it, and therefore I do think they should play a very big role in making this cleanup happen. And actually, the interesting thing is the cost of cleaning up the world's oceans is less than 1% of the net profits of the world's plastic producing companies over the course of the cleanup. So there's no doubt that they should be able to afford it. I think it's really about are they willing to step up and grab this opportunity?
It's interesting, it's I guess a very good approach not to point fingers, because you want to coerce them, or at least to convince them to come on board. Now, I was going to say, on the other hand, there is that opportunity for green investment and sponsorship, and saving the planet can be seen as a cool thing for a business to be doing. So how well are you benefiting from that?
Yeah, no, exactly. I think, if you forcing people to do things is generally not a very successful strategy. Indeed, I'd like to turn it around and say, this is like an Apollo project for Earth, right? This is something that in 50 years from now, children will be learning about in school, and they will be learning who helped make this thing happen. So I think it's it's something you should want to be part of. It's like extremely exciting adventure, and I think there's a huge reputational and also litigation risk associated with this problem. We're learning more and more every day about the health impacts that this plastic in the environment is doing. There is the harm it's doing to countries and ecosystems. I think if these companies want to be ahead of that game, I think they should have an interest in this problem, that this problem goes away. And at least I can't think of any sort of faster and cheaper way to make the problem go away than by intercepting this plastic in rivers to prevent it from going into the ocean, and by cleaning up the legacy pollution that's already in the ocean garbage patches.
And what's really nice, Boyan, is that it's not just a Western lens that's on this. I gather Kia, the car manufacturer, South Korean, is one of those that's very keen to get involved.
That's right, yeah. So we're very proud that Kia is actually one of the first companies that have stepped up, and with whom we have a partnership of significant size, where, of course, they contribute financially to enabling our work, but they also get access to the plastic we take out of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. So there is actually some of this plastic will find its way back into the electric cars that Kia is producing. It's in our interest that our plastic doesn't. There's no risk that this stuff ends up back in the environment. So we want this to go into durable, sustainable products. And I think the Kia partnership is a great example of that. And another one is that we recently announced that the next vinyl record that Coldplay is releasing, that there will be an edition of that record that is made out of the plastic that we've taken out of rivers. So I think that's another sort of cool aspect of what we do, and it also allows us to for this story to reach more and more people.
I was wondering about that. Well, now you collected all that rubbish. What are you going to do, and how much economic value is there from recycling? And of course, I think Coldplay's been a big supporter for quite a while now as well, haven't they? And I gather you're making sunglasses, rather expensive sunglasses too.
Yeah, so we made these actually as a proof of concept. So this is 100% made out of the plastic we've collected from the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. Now we're not a sunglass company, right? So for us, it was really to prove to people that this is not rubbish. This is something you can actually make beautiful, useful things at. Of course, it's the economics of recycling generally are very challenging, right? It's because plastic is so cheap. It's very often cheaper to make stuff out of new plastic rather than reuse the plastic that already exists. However, of course, the thing that we add to the materials is the story value. So, Kia is willing to pay, the millions for that plastic, not because they are in need of plastic, but because they want to be able to tell that story when they, sell their electric cars, right? So it's so that way we think it does provide an extra way for companies that join our mission to talk about what they do with the ocean cleanup.
And it's a very powerful way as well. Now, let's ask you how we as individuals could be involved. What should we be doing to help resolve the plastic problem?
Yeah, well, I think it depends on where you live on Earth. So I think if you live in a sort of middle-income country, the issue is that waste collection is limited, and where the waste goes sometimes are illegal dumps, right? But it's, of course, it's very hard to do something about that as an individual. But of course, you can make sure that at least you pay for the waste collection, and that your waste gets collected rather than that you have to dump it. I think in richer countries, it's just there's not the risk that your plastic ends up in the environment, as long as you don't litter, is just so tiny that basically the best thing you can do is actually support organizations like the Ocean Cleanup to address those interventions to the places where the problem actually is happening.
The ocean cleanup team has encountered plenty of doubters, skeptics and critics over the years, as well as praise and prizes for its work. I was keen to know what Boyan had taken on board from that feedback and how his current work may influence his future direction as he considers looking ahead to his role as a global influencer. I understand you receive a lot of messages from schools and individuals around the world. So tell me about some of those messages that might have moved you or inspired you.
It's been humbling to receive the amount of support we've received, of course, ranging from big corporations and billionaires that give us funding all the way to school children that write letters to us. And I think I'm a big believer in that. When it comes to environmental problems in general, we're going to get out of this not by protesting or fighting against modernity, being against technology or business, etc., but rather to create solutions through which humanity can fulfill its needs and desires without having the negative side effects of destroying the environment. So I'm pro-environment, but I'm also pro-human, and I think if you're not, it's going to lead to solutions that are actually not solutions because humanity is going to reject them, and they're just not going to work. So I think what gives me a lot of hope is to see that that I get letters from young people that that decided not to glue themselves to the street or do that sort of approach to solving problems, but actually to channel that energy in a constructive way to start projects, to start companies, to choose a certain study through which they can become an inventor and work on new forms of energy generation, and just naming some examples. So it's so it's I think many people there's a lot of pessimism in the world these days, especially amongst young people, and especially about the environment, and giving them hope that problems are nothing more than things that need to be solved. I think that motivates them to actually get to work on them rather than, end up in despair.
How concerned are you about the effect of climate change on oceans in terms of rising tides and collapsing currents, which some people believe could actually lead to a new ice age in Europe?
Look, I think it's all about timescales, right? So I think when it comes to human timescales, I think some of these scenarios are still quite far away. But then if you look at the geological timescales, 100 years is nothing, right? And I would love to see humanity thrive, not just for the next 100 years, but for the next 100,000 years or 100 million years, right? So I think in that light, we do live, I think, in a very special slice of time where the Industrial Revolution is essentially yesterday on a geological timescale, right? And we still, and that has given us a tremendous amount of wealth, and I'm immensely grateful for those who came before me and created the modern world. But we haven't achieved technological maturity yet as a civilization. We still have, the problems. We still haven't managed the side effects, when it comes to the pollution, the CO2 emissions, etc., that this modern civilization is creating. So I think, I think that is a key challenge that we have in this century. And of course, if we don't solve it in this century, the longer you wait, the harder it is. So I think, I don't think the world ends in 10 years. At the same time, I do think these are real problems, and I think we can solve them if we do what humanity is good at.
A lot of people would be interested to know the average age of a CEO among Fortune 500 companies is 57. Now, you came onto the scene with a bang, literally, as a teenager, and you recently turned 30, and you've already accomplished so much. So what else do you have in store for the world?
Actually, it's terrible turning 30. And it's like, I'm really starting to feel very old, actually. But
thanks. I'm double your age.
no offense. It's it's just it's just to me the ocean cleanup. I think plastic pollution is a huge problem, and I think it will be an immense victory for humanity if we are able to solve this problem that literally covering 2/3 of our planet. If we can send that to the history books, I think it's going to be huge, and that's what motivates me every day. At the same time, I hope that what we do at the Ocean Club can be essentially sort of a blueprint of how we solve problems in the 21st century. And of course, I hope that the Ocean Club's goal is to help itself out of business. At some point in time, all these systems should be deployed, clean it up, and then at that point in time, I hope I have the opportunity to work on many other problems. There's not a shortage of ideas. It's really about having to focus now on this problem. But who knows? In a few years from now, I really hope I get to work on some other problems.
Isn't it ironic that your biggest success would be to put yourself out of business? That is interesting.
Yeah,
that you achieve it.
It was actually quite funny. Like I'm not aware of any other nonprofit that makes that explicit. While I think the majority of nonprofits, they are about solving a problem, right? So that should be their whole goal. Their whole reason to exist is to help yourself out of business. But so I really hope that more nonprofits should make that explicit.
Well, on the note of other people getting involved, another European CEO, Spotify's Daniel Ek, has put $1 billion of his own money into a startup fund to tech moonshots. Now, how much does it excite you when you see other tech-minded entrepreneurs seeking to solve global problems?
I think it's brilliant. And what's interesting, I think philanthropy has a unique, or I think entrepreneurs have a unique role to play because they are, they tend to be quite tolerant to risk. And I think what we, to have the greatest impact, you don't want to invest in the sort of safe bets because those things will happen anyway. I think what the ocean cleanup was when we started was really a sort of high risk, high rewards opportunity where the chance of the ocean cleanup succeeding 10 years ago was super tiny. But of course, if we were to pull it off, it would have this huge impact. And I think we need more bets like that. Even if you just look at the energy problem, having very cost-effective and scalable energy storage, that's something that we don't have yet. Mm-hmm. Cost-effective ways of producing things like steel and cement in a way that doesn't cause pollution doesn't really exist yet. It's not cost-effective, at least. So I think to solve those things, what we need are those kind of bets that are sort of high risk, high rewards, and people like Daniel, they're they have an immense opportunity to support those things that governments tend not to do because it's still too early stage or too risky.
Well, a quick final thought then. Your ocean journey was triggered by the amount of plastic you saw in the sea while scuba diving in Greece. You touched on that briefly. Now, if you were to go back there today, or perhaps in 10 years, what difference do you hope or perhaps expect to see?
Yeah, I think saying about 5 to 7 years, I think all going well. And if we find the support that we need to now scale up the solutions, solutions work. It's about scaling up now. But if we find those champions that are willing to help us make this scale, I think 5 to 7 years from now, is there any 16-year-old can go scuba diving anywhere on Earth, and come across more fish than plastic bags.
Actually see the fish.
That's a future to look forward to, I think. Yeah.
Well, Boyan Slat, thank you so much. You may be the youngest guest. You are the youngest guest we've had on our show since we launched. But I think you have one of the most powerful messages. So more power to you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
The remarkable Boyan Slat. It'll be fascinating to see what he does with his next 30 years on the planet. I'm Riz Khan from me and the team. Thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Guatemala. Adventure awaits at Guatemala. You can dare to explore the jungles or go on a canopy tour. The rainforests at Guatemala are perfect for thrill seekers to engage in many action-packed adventures. Guatemala is in fact known for its great outdoors. Its subtropical rainforests are protected, so people can enjoy nature-friendly activities such as hiking, biking, and horse riding. You can also hike up the Mayan pyramids. Tikal is a famous archaeological site hidden deep within the rainforest, where 70-meter or 230 feet high pyramids are seen through the canopies. It is a known UNESCO World Heritage Site that has more than 3,000 structures. And if a pyramid isn't enough for you, then you can also try hiking up an active volcano. Guatemala's Volcan Pacaya remains one of the most hiked volcanoes in the country. Molten lava slowly pours through its summit, creating huge dusk and lava fields that admittedly create an impressive landscape. Also popular in Guatemala is the breathtaking Caribbean coast. You can reach it by boating along the Rio Dulce. It is a highly recommended trip as you'll get to experience a unique, isolated island feel. There, you'll arrive to hammocks and a rustic-themed beachside. Of course, you should go meet the locals. Explore the unique highlands region of western Guatemala, which is also known in Spanish as El Altiplano. Many of the modern-day indigenous Mayan groups reside there, and it's fantastic to listen to them speak in their native tongue. The locals retain the sacred rituals of their ancestors too, and you'll definitely enjoy the view of the great mountains and untouched beauty of the region's surroundings. Take a trip to the city proper. Although most tourists would rather skip the traffic-induced capital, you should still pay a visit. The place still has enticing gems yet to be discovered.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Irene, thank you so much for joining Al Arabiya. I want to kick off by asking you to sort of walk me through how you view your role within NATO, because women today are under pressure in various parts of the world and, frankly, in the West.
So first of all, thank you for the invitation, the opportunity to have this moment of exchange about a very important topic, not only women in NATO, but I would say on women across the globe and about our rights and the general pushback, I would say, that we are facing today. The role I have at NATO, I'm the NATO Secretary General Special Representative for Women, Peace and Security, is not new. I'm the fourth Special Representative. The position was established in 2012. But after 12 years, I have to say that despite the progress that we have made within the alliance, there is still much to do. Of course, the work I do within NATO is around the mandate of the alliance. So it's specific about the role of women and peace and security. So we do not cover other issues. But of course, what we do contributes to advancing gender equality. And it is also stated in our latest strategic concept endorsed in Madrid in 2022 that advancing gender equality is a reflection of the common values of the alliance. So what I do is really to look at everything that the alliance does to make sure that gender perspectives are included. What does this mean? It means that every time we take a decision, both at political and a military level, we have to make sure that we consider the diversity of the population. Population is made by half by men and the other half by women, so we cannot take decision without considering that security is perceived in a different way by men and women.
No doubt. How concerned are you when you see President-elect Trump's pick for defense saying that women shouldn't be in combat roles?
This is a topic that has been discussed over the decades around the globe. The hope was that we had overcome the barriers, the cultural barriers. Certainly we have overcome the legal barriers. So everywhere in our across allies and also in our partners, countries, women are part of the armed forces. In different extents, I would say across NATO allies, we have an average of 12%. So if we look at the population, as I said, 50% made by women, there is still a big gap to cover this percentage. I think that we still have a lot of work to overcome cultural barriers and change the mindset. We are not all at the same stage. So this conversation will certainly be put at the table, but there is a general consensus that women have to be part of the military forces. And we have proof that nowadays, if we look at Ukraine, how incredible women are fighting now on the front line. Since the full-scale invasion, a lot of women have joined voluntarily, and that's very important to say, that they were not obliged to do it. They are around 60,000 now in the armed forces. More than 40,000 are civilians, but the rest are military, and 5,000 are fighting on the front line alongside with their male colleagues.
If the United States rolls back women's role in the military, and I mean in combat positions, does that weaken the NATO alliance and the NATO mission?
I'm not expecting this change to happen. Of course, I'm expecting maybe some conversation around this. But there is a consensus. There are policies in place. This year, in Washington, D.C., and our big yearly summit, we endorse a new women, peace and security policy. When we endorse a policy, 32 allies come together and they agree on what is on the policy.
Including the United States.
Including.
Yeah.
Indeed. And this lasts for 5 years. And the policy states very clearly that increasing participation of women in all peace and security efforts, both on the diplomatic and in the military side, is what we have to do if we want to enhance our operational effectiveness. Yeah. And this is where my work leads, to the implementation of this policy that will be translated next year in a new action plan. We are working on it. And this is where I will concentrate my effort.
Yeah. Talk to me about this. You mentioned Ukraine and the role of women there in combat positions that they've taken on as an act of necessity. There's a lot of conversation, of course, about how that war may come to a conclusion. In your mind, are women better prepared to take on roles not just in the military now, but also in government in Ukraine?
I think as historically we have seen how wars change the role of women within the society. They open up different possibilities because men go to the front line. In this case, the front line is both physical and also on the space, because we see the war in Ukraine played on the hybrid space and cybersecurity, but also with very old technique on the front line. Women have filled the position in Ukraine as they did in the past during the First World War and Second World War. We see incredible women in politics at governmental level. We see women on the front line and covering all roles in the society. Even in the defense industry recently, women have stepped up and take more position. So I think this has worked as an accelerator for the society, and I expect that women will continue to play an important role in the resolution of the conflict and in the post-conflict, where we hope a just peace will happen soon, and we will see women to continue to take their important position.
When are we going to see a NATO Secretary General who is a woman? Because I know that was something that was mooted at the time, at the last round of conversations about this.
There was a lot of conversation about this. We need to find the best candidates. I will always say there are some requirements, and requirements are that the Secretary General has to be a former Prime Minister or President. And this is where the conversation has to be broader.
Yes.
Because the point is, why don't we have more women in politics covering this position? Because automatically then we could have more candidates for the position of the Secretary General. So now we have just welcomed our new Secretary General, Mark Rutte, but as you might hear, this week he announced a Deputy Secretary General, who is a woman and from North Macedonia, and she will join us in supposedly a few weeks. And she's the second one in the history, so it's already a progress. And I think maybe next one could be.
Could it be Giorgia Meloni?
You read on my mind, because the conversation we had, it's also about the South and the rotation. You know, in alliance, we're trying to rotate, and sometimes, I mean, we see a tendency to have a Secretary General coming from the northern countries, and there was a conversation about the South, but the requirements didn't come together. So one option could be to change the requirements, and the other is to see more prime minister in the South. So, of course, Giorgia Meloni could be a candidate in the future.
Walk me through this. Today, the rest of this region continues to reel over what we've seen happen in Afghanistan, and I'm talking about the subjugation of women and girls. Obviously, that was an area of serious concern for NATO, and when coalition forces were there. In your mind, what is the responsibility of NATO today to those women that we promised a future and then abandoned?
That's a difficult conversation to take. You know that NATO operates under mandates, and when we operate out of our area of responsibility, we do based on resolution of the United Nations Security Council. We withdraw, the mission is over. So as an alliance, we do no longer have a responsibility there collectively because we are no longer present. But of course, allies, individually, bilaterally, and in different contexts, such as
and as human beings.
Yes, and they continue to provide support. The situation is very worrisome. There are no words to describe what happened. And I think that individually, as you said, a human being and with our respective roles at national level, we have to continue to speak out about what is happening there and to fight for women's rights, because the silence will really put them, you know, in we will forgive about them, even if we don't do. But in the global conversation, you see, if you read the newspaper, it doesn't really come on the news so often.
What do you think is the solution there in your mind? Because obviously there is an ability of nations who are giving aid to Afghanistan to exert pressure on them.
If I could have a solution, you know, I would try to put this, implement it. I found that extremely difficult. What I'm doing on my side is to continue dialogue with women from Afghan and see if there is a way to support. One of the focus is always how to train women to create space for dialogue for them in terms of dialogue also with the Taliban or mediation processes. And I know that there are several women who are also present in Doha a few years ago that continue the dialogue and try also to train younger generation to make sure that they will have the possibility to play a role and to exercise their right.
When you come to a forum like this one, based in the United Emirates, a country that has promoted women not just to positions in government, also mandated their participation on boards in the private sector, are you encouraged by what you see and how the region is evolving?
Indeed, I am very much. I'm very happy to be here and to have the opportunity to engage in person, because I think this is the best way when then you have a concrete example that you can share. When people ask me, what do you do? It's difficult to explain then if you don't have stories to tell. And changing the narrative is what we absolutely have to do. So it's a very positive example, and I'm really looking forward to attending the forum tomorrow.
Tell me this, what is missing in your mind from the global dialogue for women? Because when we speak about this from a business perspective, we talk about quotas and we talk about a number of women on boards. One woman feels alone, 2 women has a friend, and then 3 women can make a change. But in your mind, from a governance perspective, from a security perspective, what needs to change?
I think it's a question of the cultural change I was mentioning earlier. And it's about gender, what we call gender-responsive leadership. We focus a lot on the participation of women, but we still find resistance, cultural barriers. And sometimes women are there because government decide to do, and then speak at global level, not referring to the local situation. But at the end, there is no real willingness to integrate. So it's more a token than a reality. So I think that what we have to look is the change of mindset of who is in power today, which in the normality are men. So we have to look into what we call the gender-responsive leadership to say that to train, to dialogue with both men and women together to understand the benefit that the entire society will have if women take on more position at high level. It's not for women, it's not helping women to do something, when they say, I'm helping my wife. No, it's not about this. Because in the moment where the dynamic changes, men will benefit from this different dynamic. They will have more time for the children. They have more time even for discussion and conversation, not under the pressure. And the solution that will be found will be better solution because they will really bring the perspective of the entire society. So this topic of the gender-responsive leadership is something I advocated for and I put as a first goal of the new policy at NATO, because I think that in a male-dominated environment, while we work to increase the number of women, we have also to work with the men who are present to make sure that we can reach the same high-quality solution in a shorter time.
Bring them with us.
Yes.
Irene, it's great to have you here at Al Arabiya. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
my campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on The Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, a massive search operation continues in Washington after a passenger jet with 64 people aboard collided mid-air with a military helicopter. Authorities say no one is thought to have survived. In line with the terms of the Gaza ceasefire deal, Hamas hands over a third batch of hostages to Israel. In exchange, 110 Palestinian prisoners and detainees will be released. Also coming up, we'll be speaking to Enrique Tarrio, who is the former head of the Proud Boys, who's now a free man. He was amongst the 1,500 people pardoned by President Trump for their roles in the January 6th Capitol riots. And the White House seeks to dispel theories about last month's mysterious drone sightings in the night skies above New Jersey, while the Trump administration says that no hostile forces had been at work. Hello and welcome to the programme. We begin in Washington, where a massive search effort is underway following on from a mid-air collision between an American Airlines passenger jet and a US Army Black Hawk helicopter. This happened as the plane was coming into land at Reagan National Airport. Well, an estimated 30 bodies have been recovered so far, and officials say they do not believe there will have been any survivors. Well, there were 64 passengers and crew on board that jet, and there were 3 soldiers on the helicopter. Well, there's not been a fatal passenger plane crash in the United States since February of 2009. However, a series of near-miss incidents in recent years have raised some serious safety concerns. Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Matthew Capucci, a meteorologist who witnessed the collision, who joins us now from DC. Matthew, thank you for joining us. I gather you've got a balcony that overlooks the airport, and I'm assuming you got a very clear view. Just tell us what you saw.
Yeah, most definitely. So to kind of orient folks right now, I'm on my apartment building's rooftop, which is only roughly about 1.5 kilometers northwest of the airport. The airport's runways are right there. There is the control tower where everything sort of went down. And of course, you see the nation's capital behind me. There's the Washington Monument, the U.S. Capitol, where the president was recently inaugurated right over there. Now, this incident took place at about 8:56 p.m. last night local time. I did not see the initial explosion, but what I can tell you is, when you live this close to the airport, you're used to planes taking off and landing pretty much above you at any given point. You hear the sounds all night long. Right after 9 o'clock, it was eerily silent. The skies were just devoid of any airplane noise. And instead, it was a cacophony of sirens, nonstop sirens. At that point, 19 flights that were set to land at Reagan National were diverted over to Dulles Airport. Elsewhere, there were flights that just never took off towards Reagan. And at the same time, crews from Maryland, D.C., and Virginia all rapidly responded. But unfortunately, the collision not only was too destructive, but the water temperatures of only 1 or 2 degrees Celsius, near freezing, made it so that if there were any survivors, they simply would have succumbed pretty quickly.
Yeah, that's what we're being told by the authorities as well. And I'm just wondering, how did you realize, at what point did you realize that what had just happened was in fact a mid-air collision involving a passenger plane?
When I first sort of knew something was wrong was seeing how many sirens, or rather how many police lights were present on both sides of the street, rather the river. Typically, when we see motorcades, presidential motorcades, we see them go by, but there were just kilometers worth of police lights on both this side and the eastern side of the Potomac River, which I've never seen happen before. And at that point, that coupled with the planes just not taking off and landing, was obvious something very wrong had happened. I could not possibly fathom the idea of this being the worst U.S. collision since at least 2009, happening in the nation's capital, only 3 kilometers away from the White House, at the headquarters of the National Transportation Safety Board and the FAA.
And just a stone's throw as well from the Pentagon. I mean, it certainly looks very cold where you are. You've already talked about the freezing temperatures in the river. I'm just wondering, were there any adverse weather conditions or visibility issues last night?
By the way, that is the Pentagon, so you're exactly right. We're so close to the Pentagon. But what I can say, weather was not a factor at all. By the way, you might notice the first aircraft of the day is finally just taking off. There was a ground stop at Reagan National until 11 o'clock local time this morning. There goes the first Delta flight of the day, taxiing, preparing for takeoff. But weather was not a factor at all. Visibilities were great. Temperatures, wind conditions, everything was perfect for flying. What we believe happened based on air traffic control data is that the passenger plane, which had 64 people aboard, was cleared to land on runway 33, which is a diagonal one that goes from the southeast to northwest. It's roughly about 5,000 feet long. Smaller planes, usually like the 2x2 regional jets, use that runway. It was cleared to land. It was on the flight path. And to do so, those planes sort of have to take a last-minute left turn, if you will, to line up with the runway. Air traffic control had basically asked the helicopter to wait, confirm it could see the aircraft, the airplane, wait, and then proceed after. The helicopter acknowledged those instructions, but then evidently didn't follow through. So what may have happened is the helicopter was focused on the wrong airplane, erroneously believed they were clear to go, and unfortunately that resulted in tragedy.
Yeah, and there's a lot of air traffic in that particular part of the United States, lots of airports nearby. Some reports suggest, some people we've been speaking to have suggested it's quite a difficult airport to approach Reagan National. And I'm just wondering whether you've ever heard in the past people raising any issues about safety in the area surrounding the airport?
Definitely. I mean, I can tell you firsthand that the airspace here is just so heavily utilized. You have the president 3 kilometers away from here that requires special security clearances and restrictions nearby that prevents certain routing from around the area. So you have all the planes on very dense tracks that oftentimes overlap with military Navy operations. It's like a 3D jigsaw puzzle, if you will, at any given moment. And if one little piece of the jigsaw puzzle is out of line, the consequences can be deadly. And unfortunately, we saw that last night. I can tell you there have been times I've been taking off and landing at Reagan National Airport and seen helicopters out the window. You would not see aircraft in that close of proximity at any other airport in the country. But here in the nation's capital, you know, we've sort of worried about this for years. The chance is increasing of something going wrong. And last night, something went horribly wrong.
So what you're saying makes it sound like there was perhaps amongst people, you know, certainly people who live around where you live, which is so near the airport, that this was almost an inevitability that at some point there would be tragedy in the skies above Reagan National.
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't say I'm terribly surprised. It's horribly distressing to see, but just leaving that many opportunities for something to go wrong simply because of how crowded this airspace is, notwithstanding the fact that this airport handles 25 million people a year with only usually 2 runways operating at the same time. That's comparatively few compared to other airports across the country that have 4, 5, 6 active runways, not necessarily all at the same time, but configurations. So Reagan National does a lot with a little bit of space, and suffice to say, it can be risky at times. With that, I actually have to do additional coverage, but again, we'll have updates throughout the day today here in D.C., and my heart goes out for the victims and the families.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Matthew Capucci, really appreciate it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, we can now speak to an eyewitness who is a resident of the Washington, D.C. area. Abadi Ismail joins us now from D.C. Abadi, thank you for joining us. Just tell us, first of all, what you saw and what you heard, how you became aware of this crash.
So I have a point of advantage, a view advantage from where I live at Buzzard Points with a clear shots of the Potomac River, the Reagan Airports, the military base. I was getting ready to go to bed last night around 8:50 p.m. when I heard bang bang around 8:50 p.m. It's something unusual, something you don't normally hear only you hear it in a war zone, on a movie action. But yeah, it's absolutely caught my attention. So I immediately turned around and I looked over the window to see what's happening, and that's when I saw some smokes coming out from the south side of Reagan Airport. That's exactly where the Washington Sailing Marina, or the path of the helicopter, and unfortunately the American Airlines jets. So that was somewhere around 8:50 p.m. 10 minutes, a few minutes later, I've seen most of the resources of DC, from the U.S. Coast Guard, DC Police, DC Parks Police, Arlington Police. Every one of them have been navigating toward the crash sites. I still did not understand what's happening. And if you see in my videos, I immediately took a shots of the chopper trying to look for any visual evidence on the river. So yeah, that was somewhere around 8:55 p.m. And then the news started to break up online that some reports that 2 planes collided, helicopter, military plane collided. So very unusual scene for the DC area. Keep in mind that the DC area, it serves 3 major airports: Reagan Airports, Dallas Airports, and Baltimore Airports. And I was talking to a friend of mine who is a pilot. She was telling me that the planes have always the right of way, so they are not sure how the helicopter did not send advisory, which was very dangerous in that case. And they also say that this have been happening with them a lot, that they fly closer to helicopters for so many times around the DC airspace. Given the fact we're in the DC with so many government agencies, like I'm in this river area each and every day. I'm a master captain by the Coast Guard, so I go through that river daily. And what you notice on a daily basis, most of the plane path goes from north to south. The north, coming north, going south, and landing at DCA. For that particular event yesterday, because of the wind and other variants and other factors, the plane was flying south and landing north. And I think the helicopter was coming from the other direction. So if you notice behind me right here, right now, you see two commercial vessels from the Sea Cruise here in DC. It's trying to help with the rescue mission right now, recovering bodies. The water temperature is somewhere around 39 degrees. I can tell you with high degree of certainties that this river has a high tide and high current, meaning water from upstream coming downstream goes flowing very fast.
Okay.
So it's been almost 12 hours, more than 12 hours since the crash happened. And yet we need to find out what happened so far in terms of recovery missions, rescue and mission. So if that's the case,
yeah, can I just interrupt you? Can I just interrupt you for 1 second? Because I want to pick up on some of the points you're making, Abedi. Really interesting points. Where the plane came down, I mean, it sounds to me like it didn't come down near any houses. And that must be a blessing in the sense that if it had hit a populated area, there would have been casualties on the ground, wouldn't there? That didn't happen, did it?
The crash site is exactly 1 mile by boat from the Pentagon and half a mile from a very dense, heavy indensed area. It's called the Crystal City, full of shopping malls, residential buildings, High Tower, Amazon, HQ2, and so many other businesses, just half a mile. So you have a half a mile to the city line and about a mile to the Pentagon. So you can imagine, had this happened over the city, Arlington or DC, it would have been catastrophic. But it happened on the east side of the river by the military base, where the water is relatively deeper than the west side of the river. We're talking about 24 feet. Had this crash happened on the west side of the river, we're talking about a shallow water, 4 to 5 feet. Okay? So, yes, it's very interesting dynamic with the Potomac because the water average, the depth average is 24 feet, about 400 miles stretch. And the shallow water is mainly near the airports with a lot of tree logs and debris that are streaming from upstream down. So I'm waiting. We're waiting for some news to hear about the rescue, about any recovery. From my understanding yesterday, that the DC Park Police were able to recover 4 people. I'm not sure if they're alive or not. So there was some conflicted news of what's happening. But this is where we are as the moment.
Yeah, I mean, the authorities are saying it doesn't look like there are any survivors. They're not expecting to find any survivors. And I'm just wondering, in terms of what you can see out of your window and what you saw and heard last night, I mean, are you surprised or unsurprised by the news that it's very unlikely that anyone survived this?
So one thing I want to mention is since the inauguration day, which was about 10 days, the Potomac is frozen, totally frozen. So what I've witnessed today is airboats, boats that are able to maneuver the ice and able to get to the crash scene. And this is unusual for the DC area to have the Potomac River in a complete ice sheet. So this is add up to the difficulties to get to the site, to the recovery mission, looking down the river for within 3, 4, 5, 6 mile radius. I am shocked. I am surprised. But my fellow pilots that came on air, that I talked to them online, they're not surprised because they have witnessed helicopters, very close call to commercial pilots. And if anyone need to be blamed is the air traffic controller, plus the helicopters that are navigating in the same area and the same path of commercial jets.
And just lastly, I mean, what were the weather conditions like? Because we've had various reports that obviously from what you're saying, it's extremely cold there. Is it windy? Were the conditions in any way adverse conditions that may have perhaps played a part in this tragedy?
So the temperature is rising up. We've definitely hit 50 degrees mark the last 24 hours. However, the water temperature, as I checked, I went down, I had to check my navigation on my boat. It was 39.9 degree, which is extremely cold for hypothermia. We're talking about within minutes, you will have hypothermia. It's inevitable. So 12 hours, fast forward, no sources, no news on any recovery, any survivors, and that could lead to either hypothermia or nobody has survived the crash. It's really unfortunate.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. Really appreciate it. Abedi Ismail, eyewitness of that tragedy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, for more analysis on what happened, we can speak now to retired Brigadier General John Tykert, former Assistant Deputy Undersecretary for the Air Force for International Affairs, who joins us now from DC. Thank you so much for joining us, sir. It doesn't look like anyone survived this tragedy, does it?
No, Tom, it's really sad when the authorities transition from search and recovery, or search and rescue, to recovery, and that's what they have done recently. And sadly, we suspect that all 67 that were involved in this will have perished.
We've been speaking to eyewitnesses, and it doesn't sound like anyone was killed on the ground. I mean, had this happened a couple of kilometers away, it could have been a very different story, couldn't it?
It is, Tom. This is a very congested area. Because the planes were landing to the north, this final approach path took it primarily up the Potomac River just south of Washington, D.C., and all of the wreckage ended up in the water, as far as we can tell, just between the Reagan National Airport and Joint Base Anacostia Bowling across the Potomac.
This raises a lot of questions, doesn't it? What happened? I mean, probably lots of speculation, but at this stage, what do we know about that US Army Black Hawk helicopter? It was carrying out a training flight. What's your understanding about what's happened?
It was, and Tom, this is a very congested piece of airspace, but it's also a very particularly prescribed piece of airspace. And so all of the helicopters that fly in the Washington, D.C. area are highly qualified and specifically trained for this type of congested airspace. And while the Black Hawk was on a training mission, it was on a training mission for one of the three primary missions of helicopters in Washington, D.C., which is Distinguished Visitor Transport, or National Emergency Response, or protecting Washington, D.C. And right now, as the investigators start standing up their processes, they're going to be gathering all of the perishable information, and likely the first thing that they will look for are the tapes of communication between air traffic control and these two aircraft to see if there was confusion, what the root cause would have been.
Yeah, I mean, one of the two black boxes, we understand, has been recovered. The other one, not yet. They're usually, I gather, quite easy to find because they have tracking devices on them. But what sort of precise clues could those black boxes contain?
Because this is tending towards confusion of communication, then not only will we have gathered, or the investigators, all of the recordings between the radio calls, but those black boxes or flight recorders will have captured what was being said within the cockpits. And so if it was confusion because of communication, trying to trace down what was said, what was thought about, what were they looking for, and see if that tends towards the root cause of this horrific accident.
Yeah, I mean, had this been two passenger planes, it would have been unlikely to have occurred, this crash, wouldn't it? Because they contain devices precisely to stop mid-air collisions. But because it was a passenger plane and a military helicopter, is that where perhaps is that the link in the chain that made this such a deadly accident?
I think there's a couple pieces to that, Tom. One of them is that there are two landing runways, one to the north and one to the northwest at Reagan National. And if the helicopter pilot thought that that aircraft was landing on one and was looking for an aircraft that was to be landing on that one, then they wouldn't have necessarily been looking as they should at the other. But it is also the case that based on the nature of the flight profile, that passenger aircraft was very predictably in slow, short final flight to prepare for landing at Washington, D.C.'s airport. And the helicopter had a bit more freedom of maneuver, but they were in positive communication with the same air traffic control that the airliner was on. And again, going back to the chain of communication is going to be so critical in unraveling this tragedy and this mystery.
Yeah, the tragedy happened, we were being told by one of our eyewitnesses just a moment ago, a very short distance away from the Pentagon. And ironically, it's the Pentagon that's carrying out the investigation into this. They've launched the investigation. How long do these investigations typically take? When might we have some more sort of concrete answers as to what happened?
Well, Tom, you're right about the geography. This crash happened about 3 miles away from the Capitol, the White House, and the Pentagon. There are going to be 2 different investigations that go on here. One is going to be led by the Department of Transportation, or the Transportation Safety Board, and then the other one will be run by the United States Army. And they typically take 3, 4, or 5 weeks until they have gathered the data, they have assessed what happened, and then most importantly have assessed why it happened to get to root causes and causal factors to try to prevent anything like this from happening again.
And just picking up on what you were saying about how congested the skies are above the US Capitol, do you think this is likely to perhaps trigger a rethink in terms of air traffic safety precautions, air traffic safety norms in that area, given that the DC area does have 3 major airports, at least, within a very short distance of each other?
It does, Tom, and there have already been talks in the political sphere before this accident about concerns of congestion at Reagan National Airport. I suspect this is going to re-spark some of those concerns. But in almost all of these investigations, there are process, policy, and procedural changes that will stem after the root cause is determined to try to figure out what is the best way to make sure in this very congested airspace, as you described, that something like this doesn't happen again, and that we're managing the volume of traffic in and out of D.C. to make sure that we mitigate the chance of this type of thing happening again.
President Trump was very quick to take to social media. He said this tragedy was entirely preventable, or words to that effect. I mean, it certainly looks that way, doesn't it?
Tom, it does. This was a very clear weather nighttime situation at about 9 o'clock at night that from video cameras that showed the crash from north of the crash site looking south, you could clearly see the lights on these 2 aircraft even from that distance. And so thinking about where the confusion happened or the breakdown in communication, like President Trump suspects, is probably where the investigators are going to start.
The last deadly major air crash involving a commercial airline in the United States, I believe it was in 2009. I mean, that was more than 5 years ago, and in that accident, some 50 people were killed. When you consider that 3 million people fly in and out of US airports every single day, it suggests that on the whole, air travel in the United States is safer perhaps than it's ever been, doesn't it?
Tom, it is, and part of the reason for that is that when we do have these accidents, we are judicious about getting to the root cause, the causal factors, and the findings, and changing processes and procedures that this won't happen again. And I think that as you consider the trade-off between driving or flying, our air travel system is extremely safe. But when big events happen like this, it is tragic. It shakes everybody's confidence in the system, which is why the investigators need to be extremely rigorous and quick in getting to the root causes to assure the public that they've resolved the situations or the problems that caused this disaster.
I mean, to the investigators, what are the obvious questions that need to be raised at this stage? What would you ask them to focus their efforts on?
Tom, there are 3 major stages of the investigation. The first is to gather all the perishable data so that you can have it on hand when you investigate. The next is then to piece together exactly what happened. And the final is to get to those root causes. Some of that perishable information includes training records, maintenance records, personnel records, and then all of the communication that went on between air traffic control and those aircraft, not just in the seconds before the crash, but in the minutes before the crash, to see if there was a root cause that led to confusion way earlier than the crash. And then gathering all of the debris once the bodies are recovered and starting to piece together the aircraft and using those flight data recorders or black boxes to trace the details of what was going on in the cockpit and with the machines before the crash and during the crash will be all of the things that these bodies will be charged with investigating to quickly get to the root cause.
And in terms of ruling theories out at this stage, and again, this is a bit of speculation, but I mean, there's nothing to suggest, is there was any foul play here, and nothing to suggest that there was any foreign or hostile force in any way involved in this?
Tom, there's no indication that that was the case. I suspect that the intel agencies are going to not rule that out until they gather a bit more data. That's not the specific charge of the mishap investigators, though it is an incidental issue that they will consider. But other bodies will be running in parallel to make sure that there was no specific nefarious activity that was a part of leading to this disaster.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your analysis. Really appreciate it. Retired Brigadier General John Tygart, thank you so much.
Thank you.
In other news, Israeli hostage and IDF soldier Agam Berger has been returned to Israel for an initial medical assessment. Well, this move is part of Israel's multi-phase deal with Hamas, which has already seen the release of some hostages from Gaza and Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails. Well, negotiations between Israel and Hamas are expected to continue during this first 6-week phase of the deal. Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Dan Meridor, former Israeli Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Intelligence, who joins us from Jerusalem. Great to have you with us again here on Al Arabiya News, sir.
Nice to be with you.
Thank you. There were some pretty chaotic scenes, just judging from the video footage we saw. They came from southern Gaza in the city of Khan Yunis during the process of releasing some of these hostages. I gather 2 Israelis and 5 Thai nationals were in that particular batch. Why was everything so chaotic there?
I genuinely don't know. It's quite frightening, I have to say. I think of the hostages who are being brought by the Hamas or Islamic Jihad people, I don't know. And I think when they see the multitudes of people around them shouting and threatening, it should have been quite terrible for them. I don't know why it was that chaotic. But once they got to the Red Cross people, then to the Israelis side, it was okay. It was quite tense. The tension was quite high when I watched this on television. Quite frightening, I have to say.
Yeah, this is the 3rd hostage prisoner exchange of this particular ceasefire in Gaza. And aside from that chaos that we saw on our screens, would you say that the 19th of January ceasefire deal is in fact holding up?
More or less so, yes, but it's very touchy and very complicated. There are phases to come. Unfortunately, it was not a deal for all at once, which I would have advocated, to end up the war and give all the hostages back. But for all sorts of reasons, they did not agree on that. And it's quite a gradual deal that will take many more weeks. It's quite troubling. I hope it will go all right. But as you saw today, you can never tell.
Yeah, indeed. And for the benefit of our viewers, really, because it's quite confusing, this deal, to keep track of where we are. We're 11 days into what is a 42-day phase 1. Then we go into phase 2. Does it look like we're on track for phase 2?
It looks like it, but there are negotiations that have to be held now about how phase 2 is going to play out. I don't know what's behind the scenes. I hope that all sides concerned do all that they can, not to find why the other side is wrong, but how to get it through. It's an anomaly of 440 days. People were kidnapped from their homes, from their beds, are in the hostages and kidnapped by Hamas, and we need them back home. And there's a deal that is, I have to say, quite a heavy deal. Not an easy decision to release from prison hundreds and hundreds of people who were convicted for terrorism. And there was objection to it in some parts of the population, but I think the government made the right choice. Heavy one, risky one, but the obligation, the duty to release our people from prison, from captivity, is overriding. And I think it's a good decision. It's still touchy. I hope it will go on all right.
Yeah, as I was saying, more than 480 days in captivity for these individuals who are going about their business on the 7th of October, unaware that they would be held in captivity for 15 months. Is there, though, a sense of some muted celebration there in Israel today? It's seeing those individuals walk free and return to their families.
Definitely. I think the country as a whole watched TV tonight, or the networks, and I believe not many were with dry eyes. I think people were quite emotional and weeping because it was very emotional, very touchy. People waiting for them and fighting for the release in demonstrations and whatnot for, as you said, almost 15 months. People, most of them were taken from their homes. Today, a man that was returned is 80 years old. To be in captivity 80 years old for 460 or 70 days is really amazing. I'm happy he survived. And the problem is, on one side, we are very happy, really very happy that they are home, but still we have 87 people are still there. And we need them to come home. And it may take some months, and until everybody is back home, alive and some dead. We don't exactly know who and who. The majority is alive, we presume, and some are dead, and the bodies should be returned to burial. So the whole thing is quite heavy and tragic, but there are points of joy, and people rejoice in the scenes that you see on television.
Yeah, I mean, as you paint a picture of what must have been a really, really traumatic ordeal for those people, for their families, indeed for anybody in the country who's been following this ordeal. I just want to ask you, what sort of a state, according to the reports you're hearing and reading, what sort of a state are those individuals in, physically and psychologically, when they get home?
Well, nothing has been officially released, but the feeling is that they are better than what we suspected or what we were afraid would be. They look okay. What is inside, we don't know. There are some stories coming out of previously released people, a lady who spoke of how she was sexually assaulted, and other quite troubling stories. So we don't know the whole story, but they look on the face of it okay. Nobody was brought to hospital with emergency. This was the positive side of it.
It's extraordinary as well to think that 15 months on from the 7th of October, and after the amount of firepower that's been used, the amount of the number of lives that have been lost on both sides, it's extraordinary, isn't it, that Hamas still has a presence there in the Gaza Strip. They haven't been completely defeated, have they?
Well, you see, I am not in the habit of attacking my government abroad, but I would say this: if I were their government today, which evidently I'm not, I'm enjoying talking to Arabiya rather than being in the government, and I would have tried to not only hit Hamas badly, which they should have been done, but try to create an alternative rule, mainly by the Palestinian Authority, with the help of other Arab countries, maybe Egypt, the Emirates, Saudis, and try to replace the Hamas leadership. Because if you don't replace them, you stay with what you see. They were hit badly. Unfortunately, many civilians were hit as well, which is what happens when you have war within civilian population. All the rockets are run from there. It's a tragic story, no doubt. You're right in that. But hitting them militarily is one thing. Politically, there should have been an alternative rule. Somebody needs to rule these people, to provide them with water, with food, with everything else. And I thought that the Biden offer a year ago or so, to try to build this alternative with the Palestinian Authority. They are weak. I know they're not strong. They hate the Hamas. I know the story. But still, if they were helped by some Arab countries, there might have been a better solution by now, and Hamas might not have been that much in power.
What do you read into the fact that today's release of hostages happened quite close to the home of the deceased Hamas leader, Yahya Sinwar? Does that give us a clearer idea of where some of the other hostages might be being held? I mean, what do you read into that?
I suppose, I don't know. I suppose that the location may be known, some of the locations, but if you try to free them, to release them with the military action, they may all be killed. Because they are not free there. They are kept by prison, by ward, who may kill them if you approach. So maybe even if they know the locations, which we might know, I'm not sure, the option of releasing them by force, by commando unit, may not be a viable one because they may be killed by their guards. So the need to have a deal was clear to me and to others, in spite of the heavy prices, in spite of the fact that Hamas kept them, like at home, if God forbid your wife or your kids are kidnapped by somebody and he wants ransoms. It's not just, it's awful, but you want them free and you pay whatever it needs. Although after that you try to find the people who did it, but we were in that situation. Our families were taken from home, children, elderly, normal, regular men and women, and there was no way to release them by military action with reasonable success and less risk. So we had to pay a heavy price. And it's not over yet. I hope that it will get through as smooth as possible to the benefit of those people who were kidnapped and to all of us to stop this bloody war.
Politically, lots has been happening. President Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, held a meeting yesterday, I gather, with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. President Trump has also invited Prime Minister Netanyahu to the White House next week. I'm just wondering how you see these two men working together and how you see events unfolding with President Trump now back in the White House.
One of these two men I know quite closely, Mr. Netanyahu. We were together many years. Now we are not together. The other man, President Trump, the new American president, I dare not guess what he may do. I can't decipher his activity. He's a surprise. Hopefully for the better, but I have no idea what he wants to do and how he's going to do it. I think many of us were surprised with some actions that he took. I hope he will do the right thing and will be able to get it through. I think it seems he wants this over and all hostages back and Hamas not ruling us. This is what they say. If he and the Israeli Prime Minister get their act together and the others play into this game, in that sense, it's going to be all right. But I don't bet anything on this because I don't know what's going to happen. We'll have to wait next week and maybe we meet again on El Arabiya after that.
All right. Well, we look forward to that. And we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Dan Meridor, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
The former Proud Boys leader, Enrique Tarrio, has now returned home to Miami after being released from a federal prison. This after President Donald Trump granted him a pardon, together with more than 1,500 others accused of having had a role in the January 6th attacks on the U.S. Capitol. Well, Tarrio was sentenced to 22 years in prison. That is the longest of all the sentences connected to January the 6th, even though he wasn't actually in Washington at the time of the Capitol attacks. He was, however, found guilty of seditious conspiracy. That is a charge that is very rarely used. Well, Enrique joins us now from Florida. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Just want to ask you, first of all, how does it feel to be free?
I mean, I got to tell you that it feels amazing to get my freedom back after thinking that I was going to spend the rest of my life in a federal prison. You know, and I'd like to thank, you know, my family, my mother first and foremost, and President Trump for granting the pardon when he saw the injustice that was happening. As you said, I wasn't at the Capitol, and you know, it wasn't a jury of my peers that convicted me. It was people that think differently, and I respect their opinion, but it's not fair to me, and it's not fair to them to seat them in a jury. In a case that has a lot of strong political sentiment.
Sure, and you mentioned your mom there, Zuni Duarte, and we spoke to her a couple of weeks ago, and I'm just, before I pick up on some of those points, I mean, She must be pretty pleased to have you back home, and she fought really hard on your behalf. I'm just wondering, when you were in prison, did you feel the encouragement that she was giving you?
Yeah, so throughout my whole time incarcerated, my mom wasn't a very political person beforehand. The most political thing she did was go to the voting booth and check a box. Specifically in 2016, she voted for Hillary Clinton because she wanted a woman to be elected, but she wasn't political at all until she saw what happened to her son. And the support she gave me led me through this entire time of 3 years. I spent almost my entire time in solitary confinement. So the small amount of times that I called her helped me get through it. And I'm very thankful that I have a warrior mom. And you know, now I know where I get it from.
Well, she's certainly been very busy, and I can vouch for that while you were incarcerated still. She told us you were made a scapegoat. Is that how you see things?
Yeah, I think that's how I see things, and I think in my case specifically, I think that's how most Americans see it. You know, I can't condone people that went to the Capitol and put their hands on officers, and the president was very clear. He said he was going to go case by case. And check every single, and that's what the president did. He checked every single one of these cases. It wasn't for their actions that he pardoned. It was for the miscarriage of justice in the process that they were pardoned. But it was politically motivated. Did I say some things? Did I celebrate what happened at the Capitol that day, that on January 6th? Absolutely, I did. If that's a crime, then I am guilty of it. But I wasn't charged for celebrating. I was charged for sedition, which is one step under treason, and that's why they gave me 22 years.
Okay, and we're going to pick up on some of those points in a moment, but I just want to, quickly before we move on, I want to ask you about your life in prison. I mean, you say you were in solitary for quite a lot of the time. Were you, on the whole, well treated? I mean, if that's even possible when you're in solitary confinement, or were you singled out, do you think, for mistreatment in prison as well?
So typically, it's called the SHU, right? That's what solitary is called. It's called the segregating housing unit. And usually their maximum amount of time that they, by their own policy and by what I saw, the maximum they put an inmate in there for, and it's usually for disciplinary reasons, is 15 days. In my case, again, I spent almost 3 years in solitary confinement. I went to a facility because I kept getting moved. I went to a specific facility in Petersburg, Virginia, where I didn't have a toothbrush, I didn't have toothpaste, I didn't have soap, I didn't have a shower, no razor for 3 weeks. So was I treated differently? Absolutely. And I'm not going to sit here and cry about it now because my freedom's my freedom now. But it's the conditions that me and a lot of these J6ers went through is abysmal.
Let's turn the clock back a bit and talk a bit about what happened before January 6th. And I'd like to talk a bit about the Proud Boys, described by one British newspaper as a far-right militia group, labelled by the Anti-Defamation League as, quote, misogynistic, Islamophobic, transphobic, anti-immigration. What's your definition? What do the Proud Boys stand for?
So I hate identity politics, but we do have one of our tenets is anti-racism. We don't care what color or creed you are. We also don't care what religion you are, whether you're Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Catholic, it doesn't matter to us. All we ask of our members when they join is that they go out once a month to drink beer. We're not a militia. We don't train. We're not I can't say we're a political group because that is not the focus of our organization. Our focus of our organization is just simply to make better men. Now, are a lot of our members political? Yes. But I'd say the grand majority of the guys, they're kind of like my mom back then. The most political thing that they've done is check a box every 2 years.
Yeah, but your mum voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016. Were there any Proud Boys who would perhaps have done the same thing? Was it a predominantly Republican group?
It's a predominantly conservative Republican group, but we do have, like, they're oddballs that voted for Hillary Clinton, or they were big. Mainly it's Bernie Sanders supporters. I think there is a nexus there with support. They're no longer Bernie supporters now. I think 2024, this past election changed the narrative a lot on that. But there is Proud Boys with differing political views, and it ranges, but it is predominantly conservative.
Okay, and before...
Really dominantly conservative.
Dominantly conservative, okay, got that. Of course, before January the 6th, so casting our minds now back to autumn of 2020, President Trump, he was obviously not president at the time. Yes, he was president at the time, excuse me. He told your group, the Proud Boys, to stand back and stand by. That was following on from a rally where you'd been present. And I'm just wondering what you think he meant by that, and whether you think that by your group showing up at the Capitol on the 6th of January, you were serving his best interests.
I think what the president meant by that, and also if you listen to the entirety of what happened, that exchange, there was a lot of shouting over each other, and Biden was the one that actually mentioned the Proud Boys. So the president's response was stand back, stand by. Now, what I think that meant is stand by me, and we have, and he's come through like he's promised, promises made, promises kept. Now, as far as do I regret the Proud Boys being over there at the Capitol that day? Looking back at it, yes, but we weren't going over there for nefarious reasons. We were going over there to listen to the president speak. And I actually, right after the president finished speaking at 1:15, and just for context, the Capitol was breached at 12:58 p.m. So the president was speaking while the breaches were happening. But I was actually slated to speak at 1:30 and at 2:30 on stages away from the Capitol, and at 3:30 in front of the Capitol. We also had a meeting planned for 3:30. So I don't know what when the prosecutors say, well, he planned to do this, all this thing. I don't understand how they thought that with all these plans that I actually had, I planned to storm the Capitol in less than 22 minutes and go and have a speech and then have a beer with the boys and listen to Michael Graves, lead singer of the Misfits, do an unplugged session at a hotel room.
But you weren't there at all, were you, on January 6th?
No, I was not there at all. And they took about a year and change to come pick me up after January 6th because they just didn't have the evidence. The evidence that they used to the grand jury indictment was a document that, again, it wasn't a nefarious document. It was called 1776 returns. The government admits that I never opened that document. It was sent to me, but I never opened that document, never shared it, never read it. So already the prosecutor started on a bad foot, and they used that document to get a grand jury indictment for me. And, the people of DC don't really like me or my guys. We go protest there all the time for different reasons. And they indicted me. So, but you could indict a ham sandwich, is the saying here in the States when it comes to prosecuting the citizens of the country.
Was there a rallying cry? Did you feel like you had to be there? Did your boys, as you call them, did they feel like they had to be there on January 6th? And if so, where did that rallying cry come from?
I don't think that there was we had to be there. I like going to Trump events. I thoroughly enjoy it. I love going to the nation's capital as long as I stay within the confines of the National Mall. And I traveled. That's what I did. I traveled and I spoke at events, and we did many events leading up to the election for that full year of 2020. So it's not that we felt like we had to. It's just we enjoy it.
You've called for retribution against some of those who convicted you and put you in prison. I just wonder what you mean by that and what you want to see President Trump do next.
So to clarify, and I always say it when I said retribution, I always clarify in the next sentence right over, because it is a form of retribution. I want investigation. no violence. I cannot condone violence against any human being for any reason whatsoever. But I do want investigations, and I think that some form of reparations are also in order for what we went through. Because it's not just me. There's 1,600 of us. And I think some form of reparations is required because it was political. It was political. Anybody who says it isn't, I suggest that they research a little bit more about my case. They might not agree with my views or how I say things, but to want another human being in prison for their political beliefs is outrageous to me.
But it was, the day was so unprecedented in so many ways. Symbolically, it was hugely important. You know, the seat of democracy in the United States of America was under attack. There were people there, armed in many cases with tasers, baseball bats, chemical sprays, calling for the vice president to be hanged, storming into the building. A couple of people lost their lives, some on the day, some subsequently. It was a horrific, I covered it live on television for a French TV channel. It was the scenes that none of us ever imagined we'd see. So do you understand the need to have given it unprecedented judicial treatment as a situation as a whole? Because people did die, and it could have been an awful lot worse had the police not done what they did.
I wholeheartedly agree with you in the fact that it was a day that's going to go down in history. I don't agree with that being done in order to, I don't know. There's a lot of individuals had a lot of different motivations for why they did it. I honestly think it was a protest gone wrong. And you said, do I understand why there was additional judicial review? And I also understand that because it was unprecedented. But if they were going to do it, and it was a sensitive subject, a sensitive topic, they had to do it right. They had to do it by the book. We already saw that the Supreme Court already threw out the main case before any of the pardons, threw out the main charges that were used for January 6th, which is, I think it's called impeding an official proceeding, obstructing an official proceeding. That was thrown out. If you want to go and look impartial, I would have suggested to the Department of Justice to go about it the right way, and also change the venues of some of these trials, because me and you wouldn't be having this conversation. I think if justice was truly served by the DOJ, I think I would have been acquitted of all my charges. I think some January 6ers would have been hit with some of these charges and they admit it. They'll admit, look, I did this wrong, but I don't deserve 10, 15 years in prison.
Okay, Enrique, I'm being told we're out of time, but I just want to ask you very quickly before we let you go. What have you got planned next? What are you going to do now? And you haven't had long to think about this because you've only been free for a week or so, but what do you think you're going to do next?
Well, I've had 3 years to think about what my future holds, and I did a lot of writing. I made a lot of plans. But 2 months ago, I decided to take an eraser to all that and just live my life for the next 2 months, and let the emotion out, and then really strategize and think what I'm going to do. I've been asked, am I going to get into politics, maybe run for office? That's a possibility, but it's not a priority to me right now. My priority is family, and maybe one day when I do announce that I might be running for office, I'll come back on this show and I'll let you guys know.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We hope you will come back and see us. Keep us updated. Enrique Tarrio, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Now, turning our attention to our final story of today's program. Late last year, drones buzzing over New Jersey sparked panic and speculation, with some residents believing they were Chinese spy tools, others saying they could be extraterrestrial visitors. But now the Trump administration is working to put those theories to rest, with the White House press secretary trying to set the record straight in a statement she said was directly from the president. Well, the statement said that the drones flying over New Jersey in large numbers were all authorized for research and other purposes. She also noted that many of the drones were operated by hobbyists, recreational users, and private individuals who simply enjoy flying drones. Well, we can speak now to Michael Melham, who is the mayor of Belleville in New Jersey. Mayor Melham, it's great to have you with us again, because when we spoke to you in December, you sounded pretty alarmed by what was happening in the skies above your town. Are you now feeling reassured, having heard what we heard on Tuesday night from the White House?
Absolutely not. There's nobody here in New Jersey that's reassured, including the 500 mayors that are still waiting for answers from our state government, from our federal government. I'm glad that finally the White House issued a statement, but that statement was all of a sentence or two. And frankly, as I mentioned before, it's really disappointing to find out that we still have more questions than answers. Nothing's been settled yet, and we still have drones flying over our homes here in northern New Jersey.
Well, a couple of answers we do have, according to the White House, and indeed along the lines of what the Biden administration was saying back in December. No foreign involvement. This was not the work of the enemy. Those are two of the phrases that we extracted. That does leave the question, though, doesn't it? What were those objects flying in the skies?
And that's what we still have no answers for. And speaking about the federal government and what they've said, they've also said Homeland Security here in the United States had said there's nothing abnormal happening. They've also gone on to say that these are not federal operations. So you really got to listen to what they've been saying and more so what they've not been saying. I mean, let's unpack that statement from Tuesday. It was only a sentence or two. I mean, really, it was the FAA authorized the drones that were flying over New Jersey for research and various other reasons. That was the totality of the statement. But there's a lot in there to unwind. First of all, the drones that were flying over New Jersey. I got news for the federal government. Drones are still flying over New Jersey. They were flying over my house on Tuesday night, and they were flying over my house on Wednesday night. Drones are still flying here. So when they use the past tense, that's alarming. Next thing, you know, the FAA authorized them. Well, I got news for everybody. Anything in the sky over the United States is authorized by the FAA. That could be my personal drone. That could be a company drone. That could be a small helicopter. That could be a small plane. That could be a commercial plane. Anything in the sky is authorized by the FAA. So that statement meant nothing. But then the more concerning thing was research and various other reasons. Well, what are those various other reasons? Those are the questions that we want. We think now we know who. And I say we think we know who because we don't think it's foreign. We don't think it's extraterrestrial. But the FAA is not saying it was them. The FAA is not saying it's our military. All the FAA said is that they were authorized. So we still really don't know the who was authorized to do it. And more importantly, we don't know the what. A month ago, I came to the conclusion that these were probably federal assets, that these were probably something that belonged to us, our military, or a defense contractor. So I was no longer asking for the who a month ago. I've been asking for the what. And sadly, even after the statement that was released by the White House 8 days into President Trump's administration, we're still asking for what's going on. What is the research they're doing? And what does various other reasons actually mean?
And Mayor Melham, I mean, are you seeing fewer drones in the night skies now than you were, say, a month ago? Or is the situation really completely unchanged?
It's a little bit of both. I mean, depending on the night you look out, again, we don't have many clear nights here in northern New Jersey, especially this time of the year. But we did have a couple this past weekend. And every single time I look up at any time, including last night, including the night before, you can see drones in the sky. I'm not seeing the swarm that I saw in mid-December, let's just say. Not seeing the swarm, but any time at night, if the night is clear, I can look up at the sky and point out drones. And I vet those. You know, I now know what airplanes look like when they're landing in our airspace. I mean, keep in mind, where we are in northern New Jersey, in Belleville, New Jersey, we border the city of Newark. The city of Newark is the largest city in New Jersey. There's an international airport there, Newark International Airport. We're also dead smack in the middle of the airspace for JFK, for LaGuardia, and a regional airport called Teterboro. We're used to seeing things flying. We're used to seeing planes landing and taking off. We know what they look like. They have headlights on them. They have lights on them. These are just red and green blinking lights on the wings. And if you catch it at the right time, there's a second or so where they're completely dark. Planes are never completely dark, especially in this airspace. There's no reason for a plane to go completely dark. So if you're seeing something that looks like a small plane, and I think that's part of the issue. People are expecting when we say drones that it's those 4 helicopter type propellers or fans on the bottom of them. These are fixed wing aircraft. These could be 6, 8 feet. It's hard to tell from the ground, but they do look like planes. So if you do get a picture of them, people say, well, that must be an airplane. It's got wings on it. It is not an airplane. There's red and green blinking lights. There's no forward lights. And at certain times, if you catch the blinking right, it is completely dark. Those are drones. Those are not manned aircraft.
I just want to sort of get a sense of the mood in your town right now, because a month ago there were a lot of theories doing around, not just in Belleville, but right across New Jersey and in other states, I should add. People were coming up with all sorts of theories as to what those objects in the skies were, some of them pretty far-fetched. Have people calmed down a little bit more? Would you say that perhaps some of those theories have been laid to rest?
People have calmed down a bit, and sadly, I think that's just the generation and the time that we live in. The news cycle only seems to last 24, 48, dare I say 72 hours, and people are on to the next thing. You know, people on social media are used to a 15-second video clip, and then they move on to something else. So, and part of that may have very well been the plan. I mean, let's just see how long the people stay focused on this, because I do see that people are still concerned. People see me, they know I've been out there talking about it, so they do engage me. But I am thinking that the average resident knows what they saw a month ago. They still look up here or there. They know they're there. They must be trusting at this point, it's probably the federal government. I'm going to take them at their word. They're not really seeking the answer, because I do think the news cycle has moved on. And that's sad. So thankfully that, I still have a bully pulpit. I still have a mechanism. I still have media outlets and social media and people like yourself that are still engaging this story. And we are keeping the pressure on. Just 5 minutes ago, I ended a call with my congressperson who called me up to check in with me to find out, what I'm thinking. And I told her, I said, listen, I was very disappointed in the Biden administration for basically telling me, my residents, and 500 mayors that we're nuts, we're seeing things, and it's all misidentification. I was not happy with the Biden administration. And I did take, and I still do take President Trump at his word. He has now spoken on this topic for 3 or 4 times. He said the federal government knows. He said the president knows. He said, I'll let you know within the first couple of days in office. Well, that took 8 days. I'm okay with that. But the statement doesn't cut muster. We really need some more information. You can't just tell me that you knew the whole time. I mean, if the FAA did flight restrictions over 22 municipalities and then added a few more municipalities, I think they got up to 40 municipalities with flight restrictions, literally saying that they can use deadly force to take down a drone, yet they forgot to mention that these drones that supposedly these flight restrictions were going to stop were authorized by them. Nobody's buying it that's paying attention to the story, and we have to keep the pressure on.
And just finally, Mayor Melham, I mean, you mentioned that, in fact, we haven't really heard anything new from the White House. There's nothing that came out of the White House statement that the Biden administration wasn't saying. But I'm just wondering whether you feel like people believe more what is being said by the Trump administration than believed the Biden administration, which did have some issues when it came to communication, shall we say?
Yeah, so prior to Trump administration, Biden administration, I mean, I was told myself, I was on a call with the White House, 500 mayors were on a call, and we were told point blank, there's nothing. You guys are seeing things, it's misidentification, it's all personal drones. We were literally told there was not one credible report of an unmanned drone that they weren't aware of. So that was the first thing we were told. Then we were told by members of Congress, again during the Biden administration, members of Congress, somebody out there saying it's an Iranian drones landing on a mothership, off our coast. Then we had the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee, pretty high-ranking guy, by the way, tell us it was China. So we did have messaging going on with the Biden administration. Trump said, I'm going to let you know what it was. Now Trump comes, and finally a statement comes out that basically acknowledged, for the most part, if you read between the lines, acknowledging that we were not seeing things, acknowledging that there were drones up there, but then they cover it by saying, well, they were authorized by the FAA to do research and various other reasons. And that's the part I have a problem with, because why didn't they just tell us that from the beginning? number one. And number two, those answers aren't enough. We want to know what the research is. Listen, we have areas in this country with miles and miles of acreage, tens of hundreds of miles of, Area 51 in Arizona and New Mexico. We have deserts that experimental planes that everybody suggests are out there, 10, 15 years before we actually see them, which I believe that's where this stuff gets tested. Why are these drones hovering over such a densely populated area in an urban area like northern New Jersey? What is it that they're doing? That's what we want to know. But to answer your question more pointedly, I do think people at this point say, okay, the federal government's saying they were aware. It's not a foreign adversary. Okay. I think they're kind of okay with the cover story we're getting. And it kind of sounds like a cover story to cover the fact that the Biden administration didn't even have a cover story in place. But I do agree with you. I think people are now saying, okay, well, it's our federal government. They're up to something up there. I'm somebody who's always cautiously suspicious of anything the federal government does, and I kind of want to keep my eyes and ears on it. So I'm one of the people that want to know what they're doing just above my home.
Okay, well, I don't think we've heard the last of this one, but thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Michael Melham, Mayor of Belleville, New Jersey, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
That is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.
At Al Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Mr. Eli Cohen, Minister of Energy in Israel, can you tell us what happened in Doha, in the talks of the hostages, the Israeli hostages in Gaza? Is there any development in these talks in Doha?
There is progress in the negotiations, but there are details that have not yet been agreed upon. Hamas understands that Israel is determined to recover all 100 hostages. The negotiations are being conducted under fire. Hamas is receiving blows and understands that there is no one to save it. Not Hezbollah, not Nasrallah, who is in hell, not Iran, nor anyone else. Additionally, in exactly 2 weeks, President Trump is expected to take office, which will mean increased international support for Israel. I am sending a message to Hamas. Anyone who harms the hostages will be held accountable. All the heroes of Hamas who posted pictures on October 7th while assaulting Israeli citizens will be held accountable one by one. We have everything documented. The same applies to anyone who harms the hostages. They will be held accountable.
Now, can we say that there is we are close to a solution to this issue of the hostages?
There is a narrowing of gaps. Ultimately, in my estimation, the matter depends on Mohammed Sinwar. The Sinwar family has brought disaster to Gaza, where there are evacuees and displaced people who have witnessed the strength of the Israeli army. The state of Israel can be surprised, but it cannot be defeated.
Can you tell us when this war will end in Gaza?
When 2 main conditions are achieved, when the hostages are returned, and when Hamas leaders lay down their weapons and leave the Gaza Strip.
You will accept that the Hamas leaders will leave Gaza and not to kill them?
Anyone who killed Israelis will be held accountable. If they want Gaza to take a new direction, they must understand two things. The hostages must be returned, and Hamas must not control Gaza the day after.
But we see that Hamas can launch missiles, rockets to Israel till now. After 1 year and 2-3 months, they are still attacked Israel. How this war can be, how can you win in this war?
The outcome of the war is clear. The state of Israel is superior. All the senior Hamas leaders have been assassinated. The division commanders, Al-Daif and Sinwar, have been eliminated. Hamas infrastructure, including its terrorist infrastructure, has been destroyed. They have seen Israel's strength and know that Israel can enter anywhere in Gaza and any time. They can no longer fire hundreds or thousands of rockets toward Israel. The October 7th attack was suicide for Hamas.
But we see that they are also kill soldiers in Gaza. Every 3 days, they kill 1 or 2 or 3 soldiers. Are you accept that? You will stay there and accept that your soldiers will be killed by the Hamas people?
We have brave and heroic soldiers and commanders. While our leaders and soldiers are on the front lines, Hamas leaders are hiding like rats. Mohammed Sinwar and others are too afraid to show their faces. We are there. For us, women and children are in the rear while we fight. For them, they use women and children as shields for terrorists and attackers.
How much time you will stay in Gaza after after the hostages issue will be solved? Did Israel plan to stay in Gaza more time than you are there?
The state of Israel can act in Gaza against any attempt to revive terrorism and against any attempt to produce weapons.
Even if it's after the day after?
We will not allow a reorganization of terrorism. Ultimately, the Muslim Brotherhood axis threatens not only Israel, but also other countries in the region. We have brought the Shia axis, led by Iran, to its weakest point since 1979. Hamas has been harmed, Hezbollah has been harmed, and Nasrallah is no longer with us. As a result of Israel's actions, the Assad regime has collapsed. We are working against Iran. The Shia axis is hence at its lowest point. We are proving one thing: whoever raises their hand against Israel will have it cut off.
Will you accept the Palestinian Authority walking in Gaza the day after?
The Palestinian Authority continues to encourage incitement in its educational curricula. If you read the textbooks of the Authority, you will see that they glorify murderers. This is not a way to reach agreements with us. Even President Biden has said that the Authority needs serious reforms, and this issue will become even more prominent during Trump's term.
If they will make changes in the Palestinian Authority, are they will go and work in Gaza the day after? You accept that as Israel?
I believe we will first need to see a transitional period, with the presence of international forces such as the United States, Europe, and moderate Muslim countries. We want to live in peace and happiness with our neighbors in Egypt, Jordan, and the Gulf countries. We also have common interests against extremist Islamist jihadist elements and Iran's agendas. Iran is like cancer. Every country it has intervened in has been harmed. It has destroyed Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen, and it is affecting Iraq as well. Other countries want Iran distant from it because, wherever it is present, it works against their interests. In Jordan, the dream now is to rid themselves of Iranian interferences because they have seen what happened in Lebanon, where the economy was destroyed and people's lives were harmed.
You mentioned Iran. Will Israel attack Iran, the nuclear program?
Israel pledges that Iran will not possess nuclear weapons. I believe that an international coalition led by the United States must act against Iran, and if they do not, Israel will. Ultimately, Iran is a country that denies human rights to its people.
You already attacked in Iran. You can repeat that?
We have proven that we can reach any location in the Middle East, even over 2,000 kilometers away from Israel, with accurate intelligence and significant capabilities. Preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons is not only in Israel's interest, but also in the interest of the world and the entire region. I am fully aware of what the Islamic countries surrounding Iran think. I am in contact with my colleagues, the foreign ministers. They are wary of Iran.
You mean Bahrain and UAE?
I won't mention specific names, but all Islamic countries surrounding Iran want Israel to win its war against the Muslim Brotherhood and in its confrontation with Iran. This is what all countries want. Israel is the only country capable of acting and fighting. This is an international and regional interest. Our vision for the future includes the resumption of peace agreements, such as the Abraham Accords with the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco. We see tourism flourishing between these countries, trade agreements being signed, cooperation increasing, and regional stability strengthening. We think that the relationship is ongoing and continuous. I believe that Trump's era will be a time of clarity in addressing Iran. It will be a time when regional stability could advance and peace agreements could be expanded.
Do you think that Saudi Arabia now want to continue the negotiation and the talks with a normalization with Israel without solution to the Palestinian issue?
First, Saudi Arabia must focus on its citizens. The threat to Saudi Arabia does not come from Israel. Israel could be a partner to Saudi Arabia. The threat facing Saudi Arabia comes from Iran. Therefore, an international coalition led by the United States and moderate nations would primarily benefit Saudi Arabia in addressing these threats. We have the potential to achieve peace with the entire Sunni Muslim world, including Saudi Arabia.
Can Israel make peace with Saudi Arabia without any development in the Palestinian issue?
I say, if we consider Saudi Arabia's perspective, its primary interest is stability in the Middle East. Wherever Israel is not present, jihadists and Iran's influence take hold. For example, Israel withdrew from Gaza. And what happened? The Hamas government, a terrorist state, took control. Iranian influence took hold. The residents of Gaza did not get democracy, human rights, or a better standard of living. Their quality of life significantly declined.
Yes, but I ask you about Saudi Arabia, not about Gaza, not about any place. What happened in Syria now when those organizations, the Muslims, jihadist organizations now, control Syria? What do you think as Israel? It's something that make you very, can this influence in Israel?
We are monitoring what is happening in Syria. First of all, we want to defend our towns. We clearly tell all parties there that we will address any attempts to transfer weapons to Lebanon from Iran or Iraq or Syria. There's no doubt that the current rulers of Syria have a very controversial background, as they include former Islamist jihadists and former Al-Qaeda members. It remains to be seen whether they will attempt to go back to their old ways. The world will be evaluating them, and Israel will also do so. I advise them not to test Israel or defy it. We are a country that wants good neighborliness. Anyone who seeks to harm or threaten Israel will end up like Sinwar and Nasrallah.
Will Israel withdraw from the places that you occupied from the Syrian land?
We are present there to ensure the safety of our residents, and we want to see where Syria is heading. When we see that its direction respects the ceasefire agreements of 1974, and when we ensure the security of our northern residents, then and only then we will move forward.
There is talks that Israel support the Kurds and the Druze in Syria. It's true? Are you supporting those people?
First of all, we have good relations with the Druze around the world and, of course, in Israel. The Druze in Israel are our brothers and allies, and we have a very good relationship with them in Israel. Israel also has a historically good and a close relationship with the Kurds.
Are you planning to make with them something in Syria, autonomy or something like that, or you are waiting for their decisions?
We believe in preserving all communities and ensuring that no harm comes to the Kurds and Druze. They should not be harmed, and we have a close relationship with these groups. It is essential to protect minorities, and this is an expectation from anyone involved in Syria.
And what about Lebanon? What will be with this ceasefire? Will end in 2 or 3 weeks. And after that, is Israel will stay there, or will Israel will go to the border?
Israel insists on the implementation of the agreement and expects the Lebanese government and other parties involved to respect it. They must ensure that Hezbollah withdraws behind the Litani River and that Hezbollah does not infiltrate the Lebanese army. Israel has fulfilled its mission, and the Lebanese people now have an opportunity to regain their country. So far, Hezbollah has done nothing good for Lebanon. It has only acted in favor of Iran. Hezbollah does not take orders from Beirut. It takes orders directly from Tehran. Lebanon used to be the Paris of the Middle East in the 1980s, and we want it to return to that. We have no quarrel with Lebanon or any problems over these issues. This is their opportunity to cut off the axis with Iran and make Lebanon a country for the Lebanese. That is the goal, and in the future, we can live as good neighbors with them.
After 60 days of this ceasefire agreement, Israel will go out from Lebanon to the border?
There is an agreement, and there are conditions within the agreement that must be implemented. Among them is ensuring that Hezbollah does not infiltrate the Lebanese army and that there are no attempts by Hezbollah to maintain combat equipment in areas near Israel while ensuring Hezbollah's withdrawal behind the Litani River. They must respect the agreement. If they do, we will see how things go from there.
Mr. Cohen, are you worried from that your photo is a target of the Houthi?
I don't appear to you to be worried. I feel very secure in Israel. We do not only have the best offensive capabilities in the world, but also some of the best defensive capabilities globally. The one who should be worried is Abdul Malik al-Houthi. If he continues down this path, he will end up exactly like Nasrallah and Sinwar.
Can Israel do it?
Israel has proven it can reach anyone, anywhere. We have reached places far more complex than Yemen.
But the Houthi they are working with Iran, for Iran. Why didn't you go to Iran instead going all the time to the Houthi and make strikes there and attack them once a week or 2 weeks?
As long as we do not deal with the head of the snake, which is Iran, there will be no stability in the Middle East. It is important to note that we have no conflict with the Iranian people. Israel had good relations with Iran until 1979. I believe that one day there will be relations between Israel and the people of Iran. We have no conflict with them. Our conflict is with the Iranian leadership, the extremist Islamist leadership that harms people, infringes on human rights, destabilizes the Middle East, and works against Israel. Iran must understand that it must abandon its nuclear weapons plans and stop funding terrorist organizations. Iran must focus on Iran. We see that the Iranian people have no future, no prospects, and low living standards. The per capita income in Israel is 10 times that of Iran. Those who focus on their own country and relations with the West achieve a better standard of living. Learn from Israel.
Mr. Cohen, I want to ask you something else. When you were a foreign minister, you met the foreign minister of Libya, Mrs. Najla El-Manqoush. Can you tell us about this meeting, why and how, and what you discussed with her?
The meeting's purpose was to improve Libya's relations with the West. That was the goal of the meeting. We have no conflict with Libya. There are many Jews in Israel who are from Libya, and they would be happy to visit their country. Therefore, we have no conflict with Libya. It is in Libya's interest to open up to the West. Otherwise, it will continue drowning in its internal crises.
Mr. Cohen, thank you very much.
From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deep fake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
my campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on The Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.